listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome to the mother of all talk shows, the Open University of the Airwaves, the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees and you are positively encouraged to speak back to the teacher. Tonight we'll be deep diving with sharks, real sharks, and a humpback whale or two. Financial sharks, those that have made so very much money during the pandemic, some of whom haven't paid a dime in tax upon it. And political sharks, the sharks in the water off Cornwall at the so-called G7. We'll be asking, how come Canada is in the G7, but Russia and China are not? Is it because of money? Is it because of nuclear weapons? Or is it because of values? In which case, why don't we inspect some of the values of those that were lucky enough to be at the G7 in Britain this week? And a word or two about the Euros. All right-thinking people will have cheered England's victory over Croatia today. It wasn't hard for me to support anybody over Croatia. But what will it be like at Wembley next week when Scotland play England? Now that's a different story. It's all coming up over the next 3 hours on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Netanyahu has gone, sing hallelujah, until you read the Haaretz profile, unlocked for one day only, on the man that's taking his place. As Gideon Levy told us, not once but twice, the people coming in after Netanyahu are even worse than him. But still, call it schadenfreude if you like. I cannot help popping a cork and drinking some metaphorical champagne at the fact that this war criminal is no longer the Prime Minister of Israel. And I hope that he spends some years behind bars, as Israel is wont to do with miscreant leaders. Prime ministers and presidents have been sent to prison in Israel. Doesn't happen in many other countries, got to be said. And Netanyahu, now that he's no longer Prime Minister, will have to face the music of the indictment now levelled against him. That's just broken literally in the last few seconds on the BBC. The Israeli Parliament has given its approval to a new coalition government. And after what seems like decades, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is no more. These are my own views, of course. They're not necessarily the views of the management. In fact, almost certainly not the views of the management. But contrary to any other television channel, I'm free here to speak my own views. No one ever interferes with my content here, something to which I shall return later in my monologue. I said earlier today that it was not difficult for me to support England against Croatia, and there were many reasons, football as well as other, for doing so. But the game of the tournament so far had a real anti-colonial feel to it also. The Austro-Hungarian Empire used to rule what is now Northern Macedonia, and it showed. Northern Macedonia were at it from the first whistle. I think it was a draw. I had to miss the end, but the real winner was Northern Macedonia, playing at their first big competition, their first knockout tournament of this size and nature. Well done, Northern Macedonia. Well done, England. And it will be a bit like that next Saturday when England hosts Scotland at Wembley Stadium. On paper, of course, the England team is far, far better than the Scotland team. But as Bill Shankly famously opined, it's on Friday, by the way, but as Bill Shankly famously opined, football's not played on paper, it's played on grass. And Scotland will feel like 15 or 16 men on the park rather than 11. Because it's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And England can be sure that Scotland will fight like 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 brave hearts on the park at Wembley. And of course, although I wanted England to win today, I will not on Friday. But football, of course, missed a heartbeat or two just the other night when the Danish player Christian Eriksen, suffered a heart attack on the field of play. The response of both sets of fans, both sets of players, and the medical staff was really quite miraculous. The Finnish rivals to Denmark cheered Eriksen's name for the remainder of the game when it resumed. In fact, they sang a duet with the Danish fans, chanting his name. The Danish team formed a protective ring around their stricken player because inexplicably, some television channels, including the BBC, gave us long, lingering shots of a man they must have believed was actually dying on camera. And just to cap it all, long, lingering shots of his weeping, distraught wife being comforted by the captain of the Danish football team. It was the latest in a long, long line of disastrous decisions by the BBC, which is just still more reason to welcome on air at 8 o'clock this evening Andrew Neil's GB News. I have known Andrew Neil since he commissioned me to write a double-page spread in the Sunday Times when that was something to have almost 40 years ago. And a very good show they gave the piece also. Andrew Neil was then, as now, politically very far distant from me, but showed in commissioning me that he was more interested in getting to the truth, getting to the heart of the matter, rather than following some preordained script. And I believe he's never changed on that. You've all watched him for years on the BBC, giving just as hard a time to Boris Johnson when he's able to catch up with him, when Johnson's not running away, and if he does run away, then his subordinates get it from Andrew Neil, as he gave to Jeremy Corbyn or anyone else. The point about Andrew Neil is he knows his stuff. And it's without fear or favour that he goes into these interviews with politicians of all stripes. So I don't share the view, much expressed on what calls itself the left, that this is going to be some kind of Fox News. Like Sky and the BBC are somehow paragons of virtue in any case. They're not. And neither will GB News be Fox News. There are far too many sensible people that are going to be appearing on it. And Andrew Neil is far too sensible to position his new baby in that part of the market. So although it starts at 8 o'clock, and I don't want you to switch over, If you really must, then keep us both on at the same time. He's on the television screen, we're on the computer. The BBC and Sky, for that matter, have asked for it. And they've been at it again all weekend. The coverage of the G7 in Cornwall is so biased in favour of auto-Europeanism that it is almost laughable. Now, I have no position on the sausage wars over Northern Ireland. And as is well known, I've said so many, many times over many decades, I have all my life favoured the reunification of Ireland, but by the consent of the people there, not by the sordid anti-Brexit manoeuvrings of little Emperor Macron. And that's what's happening here. But you wouldn't know it if you were following the coverage of the summit from Sky and the BBC. The automaticity in which they take the side of Macron and Merkel and von der Leyen and the European Union's bloated, corrupted dictatorship against their own country is really something to behold. And it provides actually the perfect backdrop for Andrew Neil's new television station, which will have no automatic bias towards the EU, no automatic bias towards Scottish separatism to punish Britain for having voted to leave the European Union, and perhaps above all and in the longer term, no automatic bias towards liberal wokeism. I was accused on Twitter, I think for the first time, this very evening, of being a gammon. Now, some of the viewers and listeners overseas will not necessarily know what a gammon is. It's true that I'm white. It's true that I'm straight. It's true that I'm married with 6 children. For some liberals and so-called leftists, that means I should get my coat. But my sleeves on my coat are rolled up to fight for what's right, to fight for the interests of the working people. And if that makes me a gammon, well, give me the pineapple now and set it upon my breast. I am not a gammon. I don't believe that GB News will be gammon TV, but it's come to something when people are boycotting advertisers on a channel that doesn't even begin broadcasting for another 47 minutes. I personally believe that the woke liberalism of Britain's media, particularly its broadcast media, the Europhilistinism of their coverage of Brexit and its aftermath, the automatic way in which they take the side and the part of other countries against our own, the way that they seek to present the culture and the values of the people of these islands, leads me to believe that they are broadcasting to a nation that they hate. They really don't like the British people. They don't like how they vote, how they think, how they voted over Brexit. They don't like how they live their lives, which are as different from theirs as it's possible to imagine. A friend of mine works in a very, very big media house, and she was the only person in the building that voted for Brexit, because all the others were enjoying the cheap baristas and au pairs, glaziers, plumbers, bricklayers and joiners that came their way in an endless stream from the cheap labour markets of East and Central Europe. I myself believed in Brexit and believe in it still, not because it is necessary, but not because it's sufficient. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. if we're going to build the Britain that I want to see in this green and pleasant land. Now, in the week that a man was swallowed by a humpback whale and spat out again, a lobster farmer in the United States, we'll be taking a deep dive with sharks. Real ones and metaphorical sharks. The kind of sharks that have made literally billions of pounds and dollars selling to the government inefficiently and in some cases undoubtedly corruptly during this pandemic. We'll be looking at the sharks that have doubled, tripled, quadrupled their businesses without paying a penny extra in tax when they should be paying decent levels of tax all the time, and a windfall tax, a corona tax, on the excess profits that they've been able to make as a result of other people's misery and the destruction of other businesses on the high street, small and medium-sized, and even one or two large businesses. We'll be talking about the American media market with the absolutely wonderful Rachel Blevins, and the British media market, maybe get a review of GB News from the irrepressible Patrick Christys. All of that coming up over the next 3 hours on the mother of all talk shows. I think I'm going to ask you a question. In 2005, on this day, which rock star was cleared of child abuse? A, Mick Jagger, B, Gary Glitter, C, Michael Jackson. Answer right after this break.
Radio Sputnik.
Gosh darn, how do you get this thing to work? Is it that one? Is it this one here? Gosh, was this thing built in America? Jeez. Kamala, would you get in here? I can't get the, gosh darn wireless to work.
You know I can't answer questions, Joe, when I'm laughing.
I'm trying to, listen to that Scottish guy on the wireless, the Galloway fella.
Oh, Joe, you're so funny.
I've been pressing this red button on and off and on and off. Heck, I can't get it to work. Hello, Biden residence.
Mr. President, be advised, we have executed the airstrike on Syria. Confirmed.
That's just great. How long until it gets delivered? I'm starving.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Well, I asked you earlier, why is Canada in the G7? That's our poll this evening. Perhaps I should explain myself. The G7 is supposed to be a grouping of the biggest economies in the world, and Canada is not one of the biggest economies in the world. It's supposed to be a grouping of democracies, but most democracies are not in the G7. India is the biggest democracy in the world and isn't in the G7. Indonesia is the second biggest democracy in the world and isn't in the G7. There are lots of democracies nearby to Cornwall that are not in the G7. And then I heard it was about values. So let's examine, if we can, Canada's values in this context, and there are many, many more. A country built on the graves of the Indigenous people of Canada who were ruthlessly massacred and suppressed throughout North America. But in cuddly Canada, just as much as ugly America. But the Canadians had a special twist to all of that. Hundreds of bodies of Indigenous children have just been exhumed in the grounds of schools to which they were forcibly sent as late as the 1970s, having been taken by force from their parents so that they could be educated in the Canadian way, according to Canadian values. And hundreds of them never came home and were buried there in unconsecrated ground, in the grounds of those schools. And Canada has done nothing to make amends for that. So values, Canada, please. Now, that's the poll. Why is Canada in the G7? A, lots of snow. B, lots of money. C, lots of values. You can vote on my Twitter feed. Now, am I going to Professor Deirdre? We're going to a call first. It's Jamie in Malaga. Go ahead, Jamie.
Good evening, George.
Good evening.
Thank you for taking my call.
Welcome.
Seems to be rather an echo, but it's better now. Really just to say about the two events relating to Julian Assange. One of them is that 24 UK MPs have signed an open letter and sent it to Joe Biden, dated... 24? Only 24, yes. Asking him to drop the charges and explaining the effects this will have on the freedom of press and the First Amendment. So that's something that I hope he will have read before he went to Cornwall for the G7 summit. At the same time, there's a tour, the home run tour of America, I think 21 different cities, being carried out by Julian's father, John Shipton, and brother, Gabrielle. And it's quite amazing the energy that they've got. And one of the interviews I saw with them was one of the events was in New York on Thursday last week, where there was Roger Waters who spoke, who was brilliant and equally...
I didn't realize that was the tour. That was a brilliant interview with Roger Waters of Pink Floyd.
Absolutely, just amazing. I mean, what a brilliant person. I think he's 77 years old and just keeps fighting for human rights and activism.
He's a model for us all, Jamie. He's an absolute hero. An absolute hero on Palestine, on Assange, on all the big political questions.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And
he also
equally,
told Facebook to get stuffed when they asked for permission to use another brick in the wall in their advertising. The same Facebook that deliberately, willfully, and illegally, in my view, actually took a Palestinian flag out of Roger Waters' hands from a picture he had posted on Facebook and left him empty-handed.
Absolutely disgraceful, and I think the words he used for Mark Zuckerberg were not as polite as the ones you gave.
They were too strong to broadcast here.
Exactly. And then the other person who spoke was Chris Hedges, who's quite incredible, and explained the case and the danger to really, democracy in the free world. If this goes ahead and Julian is taken to America, I mean, it'll be an effective death sentence. So it's
God bless all of those on the home run tour. And all I can say is I'm sorry to say that there were only 24 British MPs signed a statement of such historic importance. But don't count on Joe Biden reading it. I'm not sure exactly what his reading age is these days. Thank you very much indeed, Jamie. Now, Professor Deirdre Heenan is Professor of Social Policy at Ulster University. I said earlier that the sausage war and the chilled meats affair has not grabbed me. personally, but it's quite clearly a cause, if you'll forgive the pun, a bone of considerable contention between Britain and the EU, whether genuinely or not, and it has the possibility of causing real trouble on the streets of Northern Ireland. Professor Deirdre, welcome to the mother of all talk shows. Most grateful to you for making the time to explain to us about the sausage wars.
Well, first of all, can I allay your fears that people in Northern Ireland can indeed get sausages if they want sausages, and this has been how this issue has been depicted in the British media, but it isn't actually an issue really about sausages. It's a bigger issue about trade and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the reality is that whatever you think of Brexit, whatever your views were to leave or to remain, the reality is how the British government have treated Northern Ireland in this negotiation and subsequently is a damning indictment of them. So we were told that when the Northern Ireland Protocol was signed, that it was a great deal, a fantastic deal, and there would be no checks to GBNI or NIGB, that there would be free-flowing trade. The reality is that is not the case. And in terms of sausages, it is not possible to move chilled meats, and that's why this has become known as the sausage war. We're currently in a grace period agreed by the British government and the European Union, but that grace period is due to end in July. And then there are real worries that people will be able to see that, in fact, there is an Irish Sea border, that it becomes a reality, and that the government can no longer say, oh, this border doesn't exist. Now, of course, another difficulty is the British government have then said that they will unilaterally extend the grace period, thereby breaking the law, breaking an international treaty that they signed up to. And the European Union have said if that happens, then they would be forced to take action. So essentially, at the heart of this is dishonesty and mistrust. And people in Northern Ireland in particular, whatever community they come from, feeling that they have been treated particularly badly, that Northern Ireland has been sacrificed on the altar of a hard Brexit.
Well, there are a number of things at the heart of it, and that may well be one of them. Let me run a couple of the others past you. I warned everybody not to trust Boris Johnson, but they did, including the people elected to represent the Unionists side of politics in Northern Ireland. The line down the Irish Sea, which is where, personally, I believe the border between Britain and Ireland should be, has not got the consent, yet at least, of the people of Northern Ireland, which is required under the Good Friday Agreement. So why were the Unionist politicians so gung-ho for Brexit when this was undoubtedly one of the obvious consequences of it?
Well, I think the issue in political circles in Northern Ireland is why indeed did the DUP, the only party in Northern Ireland, support Brexit against the wishes of the majority of people in Northern Ireland, and never explained what they viewed to be the benefits of Brexit. And then, when they were in the Confidence of Supply Agreement, hitched their wagon to the hard right ERG. So really what happened is they were sold out by English nationalists. Boris completely blindsided them, and Ulster Unionists have painted themselves into a corner. They know that they can't abolish the protocol, even though the new leader of the DUP has promised that he will indeed get rid of the protocol, that mitigations and derogations and sandpapering off the edges isn't enough for Unionists, because in the end, for Unionists, this is not actually about trade. It's not actually about sausage wars. It's not about chilled meats. It's their belief that that border down the Irish Sea has impacted on their identity and part of their British identity. And whilst you say consent is a principle in the Good Friday Agreement, yes, it is, but it is around a certain principle. It's not consent for everything. Not everything has to be measured up against that consent principle. So, for example, the DUP are now complaining about consent, yet the majority of people in Northern Ireland did not want to leave the United Kingdom or the European Union. More importantly, the majority of people in Northern Ireland did not support a hard Brexit, but we were not asked for our consent around that, yet the DUP supported that in the negotiations, supported the ERG and turned down a number of possibilities that would have led to a softer Brexit where we wouldn't be in this problem. So I think when we talk about consent, we have to be careful what we're talking about, and also remember that the DUP supported the protocol when they first heard of it because they believed that it would come with a unionist veto. It was only when it became clear that there would not indeed be a unionist veto that they then said it was no longer a safe and sensible solution, which is how they described it in the first place. So consent cannot be consent of one community. And I think that is what's caused a great deal of anger and mistrust on the ground in Northern Ireland, that people really feel now the Good Friday Agreements were brought into this, that people are conflating issues. The consent is whether or not the majority of people want to remain in the United Kingdom. There's nothing written into the Good Friday Agreement that says you must have consent around an Irish Sea border, because of course we didn't imagine it. But you quite rightly say that you and many other people, John Major came here with Tony Blair in 2016 and warned against Brexit because they said inevitably there would have to be a border. And that border would either be in the Irish Sea or on the land. But if we wanted a Brexit, that's what would happen. And they were dismissed as scaremongers, Project Fear. But they were right. But it was totally dismissed by the British government and the DUP, who were intoxicated by the power that they had in London.
So Brexit has acted as I said it would to people that used to be friendly with me and now are not, as an accelerator of Irish unity, because, of course, the easy way to avoid all of this and remain in the European Union, which you say the majority in the North want to do, is to reunify your small country.
Well, I think the reality is the constitutional issue here was settled. It was settled after the Good Friday Agreement. People felt that if the day came that the majority of people wanted to be part of Ireland, then we would have a unity referendum. But until then, the constitutional issue had, that box seemed to be ticked for most people. There was no talk about a border poll, and if there was discussion, it was the idea that this would be some time off into the distant future. The reality is Brexit has thrown the constitutional jigsaw into the air, and we don't really know how the pieces are going to land. But we know that it has unsettled people, that people are no longer happy with the constitutional issue as it stands, but that also that loyalists, unionists, nationalists, Republicans feel that they've been duped by Boris Johnson and this government. So when we hear Dominic Raab on this morning saying how obnoxious it was of Macron to suggest that Northern Ireland was different from other parts of Britain, well, the reality is he and his government made it different. They put the border in the Irish Sea. They have unsettled people in Northern Ireland. And of course, the real worry is that what we may be looking into is a long, hot summer, because we're coming into the traditional marching season in Northern Ireland in July. And loyalists are particularly unhappy. They feel isolated, abandoned, betrayed by the British government. And that's not good for anyone in Northern Ireland. There's no schadenfreude here, because if people are unsettled, that violence often spills over into the streets and cannot be contained. So I think actually Boris Johnson has a duty to be honest with people here, to say he signed up to this in the protocol and to explain what mitigations he may be seeking. But to try and suggest that it's the pesky EU who forced us to do this, or forcing us to comply with an international agreement that we negotiated, that we signed up to, that we ratified through Parliament. I mean, it's just entirely disingenuous. And I think people
Professor, both these things can be true. If you think that Macron et al. And the EU bureaucracy love Ireland and lie awake at night fearful for its future, I've got to tell you, you are quite wrong. They are using the Irish border issue as a stick to beat Brexit with. It's the long Brexit, this. They don't give a damn about chilled meats in the 6 counties. They hate the fact that Britain voted to leave.
The reality is, though, the British government negotiated and signed a protocol, an international agreement, and they have got to stick to the terms of that agreement, regardless of what France or Italy or any other country think of it. And we don't want to be stuck in the eye of a storm again. Remember, the people of Northern Ireland have come through a great deal, and it seems that once again we're being used as political leverage. And what we're missing
but
here
you're being used by the EU as political leverage, but all of your ire is directed at the British government.
Well, my ire is directed at the British government because the British government are continuing to be disingenuous around this. Why don't they fess up to what they signed up to and either say, we didn't understand it, or indeed we did understand it, but we'd absolutely no intention of sticking to it. And once we got through and got Brexit done, then we thought we could renege on the deal. But the reality is, Brexit isn't done. Brexit is a process, and it has dramatically changed our relationships across the world. And the people who are suffering, the people who are being told mistruths, are the people in Northern Ireland. And I simply think whether it's France or the British government, we deserve honesty. The British government negotiated this with the DUP. This is what we're left with. So ideas of saying, scrap the protocol, trigger Article 16, and then what? What happens then? We're still going to have a border somewhere. It's a trilemma. How do we get away with having no border and protecting the integrity of the single market?
Well, there will always be a border, and that border now will always be in the Irish Sea. The question is, does that have to bring everything tumbling down over foodstuffs? And the answer to that is that it doesn't unless people want it to. Now, if you were looking for honesty, you were looking in the wrong place when you were looking at Boris Johnson. Honesty is probably the least of his virtues. And he launched his campaign to be the Prime Minister in Northern Ireland. He was supported by the Democratic Unionist Party, the representatives of the Unionist population. It's take onion from pocket moment here, Deirdre, because it's very hard to feel sorry about it.
Well, of course, on the one hand, you would have to say to the DUP, not all unionists, but the DUP, own this. You are the architects of your own misfortune, and you've got to just deal with it, suck it up. But the reality is, if that spills into marching on the street, protests, people being promised that the protocol will be abolished, the DUP promising that that is what they're going to do, that they're not interested in mitigations and derogations, that they're going to be able to get rid of it, and of course they've nothing to replace it, then I think it goes back to people who are already feeling vulnerable, feeling isolated, know that they have been publicly humiliated. What's the answer other than political leadership that was about addressing those tensions, saying, yes, actually, we were completely blindsided, we were humiliated. You are quite right. We clapped and we cheered at the conference when he stood up and said, no British Prime Minister would have an Irish sea border, not over my dead body. And then he went ahead and did it. And not only did he do it, then he told the people of Northern Ireland that this Irish sea border didn't exist. It was a figment of our imagination. So I think actually the levels of dishonesty are shocking. And that is why I'm directing my anger there. Because the unionist people don't feel that they've been sold out by France or Germany. They feel that their sovereign government, and they are the most loyal of British subjects, that they have been completely sold out and abandoned for an English nationalist project. And that's the reality. And many of them are now coming to see this. And if the British government are not loyal to loyalists in Ulster, who then are those Ulster loyalists loyal to? What are they loyal to when they're so dispensable?
Well, from my point of view, it's been a misplaced loyalty all along. But I suppose that's part of a bigger debate, and we didn't sign you up for that, and I shouldn't go...
We can do that another day.
We'll
That is
we'll
another
do
debate.
that. We'll do that another day. What we can't have, of course, and you kind of edged towards that, we can't be held ransom to the prospect of the marching season. We can't be, British policy cannot be dictated by those that want to march in commemoration of something 350 years ago nearly. Britain is beyond that, surely.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the reality is, if our leaders, our political leaders in Northern Ireland, sold this protocol as the best of both worlds, saying that we have access that other people would give their right arm for, and that we can become somewhere that businesses want to locate because we have access to the EU market and the GB market in a way that no other part of the UK has, then this could be sold as a bonus, a boon for Northern Ireland. But the reality is, as I said at the start, this is not about trade. This is about a belief that that border in the Irish Sea has impacted on the constitutional status of people in Northern Ireland. But the reality is it hasn't changed the Constitution. The Good Friday Agreement still says and still stands. So actually, it's really about leadership and saying to people, you shouldn't feel abandoned, you shouldn't feel isolated. Yes, you were told mistruths, but the reality is you are still part of the United Kingdom until the majority of people want something else. And recent polls this week have suggested that the majority of people, a massive majority of people, do not want to be part of United Ireland. Now, other polls have said different things, but I think it all comes back to political leadership. If you're going to march people up to the top of the hill and tell them that they've been abandoned, that they've been betrayed, that they need to take action, then what do you expect to happen? The reality is it's about time that the leaders of unionism owned their own words, took responsibility for their own actions, and realised that if violence spills out onto the streets in Northern Ireland in this summer, the only people that will suffer are the people who are living here, the people who are actually burning down their own houses. What foreign direct investment would look at Northern Ireland on fire, the streets on fire, and think, oh yes, I think that's the place I locate my business for the future? The reality is it's up to us to contain the situation, and that's about honesty, but also about practical solutions and talking about betrayal, talking about taking action, encouraging that type of behaviour is wholly irresponsible. So I think most people are calling on our politicians to be sensible, to ensure that they take the sensible route, to distance themselves from loyalist paramilitary groups, for example, who have put out a statement saying they want discontent. They want this volatile place to feel even more volatile. And that's wholly irresponsible. So I would actually like to see the British government coming here, reassuring people who feel they need reassurance and explaining what happened
I'm
and what they
struggling to see
did.
what the reassurance would look like, Deirdre.
Well, the reassurance is that actually there is an Irish Sea border, but it does not change the constitutional status of Northern Ireland.
Oh.
That is contained in the Good Friday Agreement. There's nothing in that that says suddenly you are more Irish than you were before the Irish Sea border. That is the reality, and that's a message that needs to go out there and needs to be sold.
Even I'm ready to reassure people on that. It's quite clear that Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom until a majority in Northern Ireland decide otherwise. But that doesn't get rid of the border and doesn't solve the chilled meats issue, does it?
Well, look, firstly, we've always had some form of a border in the Irish Sea. So when we're talking about honesty, part of that honesty situation is saying to people in Northern Ireland, you were never as British as Finchley. Northern Ireland has always been a place apart for historical reasons.
The clue's on the passport. It's Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Yes, so we are different.
In fact, I was once on Stephen Nolan's show, and a very prominent unionist shouted at me from the audience, "Get back to Britain." And he was right.
Yeah, well,
I had come from Britain.
My point is this: Northern Ireland has always been different. We were never as British as Finchley. We're not going to be as British as Finchley. And there were checks in the Irish Sea prior to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, of course, there's been a hardening of those checks. There have been more checks. But I think we have a joint committee. And if we work through the joint committee and allowed that committee to do what it was set up to do, because remember, there's a framework and there's a legal process. And that framework is about saying, well, in reality, there are teething problems. There are issues that actually, of course, if we got together, we could mitigate those problems. We could say, this doesn't make any sense. But part of the protocol was about the EU trusting a third country to implement those checks. So you might say, don't direct your ire at the EU, but have the British government act in a way that you would call trustworthy, that they could say, yes, these are trusted partners. We're willing to have more flexibility. We're willing to hand over more checks and more powers. Of course they're not. And at the heart of this is about trust and about an international reputation that says once you've signed up to something, you stick to it.
Okay, I'm being told to wrap this up, but in a sentence, could you answer me this? Are the DUP going to pay a price at the elections next year for their stupidity?
The DUP are going to pay a price, but I think the interesting thing is that there will be a growth of the non-aligned in Northern Ireland, a move to the middle ground, because people have tired of sectarian politics, tired of tribal politics, and the vast majority of students I teach are interested in the economy, their future, their freedoms, a liberal society. They're much less interested in the old tribal politics. These are the post-Good Friday generation.
Very interesting. Professor Deirdre Heenan, it's been fascinating talking to you. I've kept you much longer than we promised, and you've been most gracious about it. Thank you very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. How's the poll doing? Why is Canada in the G7? Lots of snow, 40%. Lots of money. They've not actually got lots of money. It's a small economy. 42%. Lots of values, 18%. You can vote on my Twitter feed. I didn't give you the answer to which rock star was cleared of child abuse in 2005 on this day. It was, of course, Michael Jackson. Now, I've got another question to ask you. It's in this week, in 1965, Bob Dylan recorded what has been rated the greatest single of all time. Was it A, Like a Rolling Stone, B, Mr. Tambourine Man, C, Knocking on Heaven's Door? My rendition of which is still available on YouTube, I promise you. Now, where am I going after this? I'm going for a quick break.
Radio Sputnik.
You know, and it's a very, thank you for, you know, I'm a big fan of your show, Gigi. Great debate, great. And I'm Scottish. I'm very passionate about what's happening there, you know. I had a great mom. She was Scottish, Mary MacLeod. She taught me well. She taught me well at everything, including golf. I love Scotland, and I love the Scottish food. It's great food. I said to Melania, you know, haggis, look at that. What's more Scottish than that? Me, I am that haggis. She said, what, thin-skinned and full of crap?
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Now, the answer was A, Like a Rolling Stone. Now, I personally think that is an absolutely earth-shattering, superb track, but I'm not sure it's been rated the greatest single of all time. Perhaps it was rated by our editor as the greatest single of all time. Now, James Glancy is a wildlife conservationist, filmmaker, and director of a conservation charity, Veterans for Wildlife. His new documentaries are on wildlife conservation and his charitable work is now legend. I hope that he is with us now. James Glancy, thank you for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. We've got a video to show of you, which is apparently, I've not seen it myself, quite breathtaking. So hang on there while we watch it.
In 2019, after filming a show for Shark Week, I went to El Malik Island to see these amazing organisms for myself. So how is it possible to swim with these jellyfish without getting stung? Well, this species of jellyfish does have stinger cells, but they are not powerful enough to cause harm to humans. They've evolved to live on algae that are attached to them, and therefore they don't need their stingers to catch prey. That means you can swim with them and not worry about getting stung. In 2005, there were over 30 million jellyfish in the lake. But they disappeared after an El Niño event in 1998. Fortunately, since then, they've made a comeback. Jellyfish Lake is around 12,000 years old and 30 meters deep. It's a remnant of the last ice age, where during that time, the sea level rose to the point where seawater began to fill the basin. As sea levels receded lower than the surrounding hills, there was no place for these jellyfish to go. So they are stuck in this lake, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
James, swimming with jellyfish would be almost as frightening for me as swimming with sharks, which I know you also do. I mean, I know it's a banal point, but how many of them stung you? And if they didn't, why didn't they?
Yeah, well, George, it's great to join you tonight. That was on the back of making a documentary in Palau, which is the world's first shark sanctuary. So a very special place because it had been overfished for over 20, 30 years by commercial fishing fleets. So the place was completely bereft of marine life. And when they created a marine reserve, it's all come back. So it's a fascinating place for tourists to visit. Now that lake in particular, that is just a relic of, that is just something created by nature. Jellyfish got stuck in this lake and they've evolved not to have a sting. So you can jump in there and swim with them. Absolutely brilliant experience.
Well, now you're talking. Jellyfish that can't sting. Even I would swim amongst those. Now, you've seen the nautical frolics off Cornwall, and you've heard the soft words of the G7 about resetting the environmental issues, climate change and the rest. Were you impressed?
It's always hard to know with Boris because they're really making a huge effort with COP26 in Glasgow. As you know, they really want to make an impact on the world and set a new environmental standards. But at the same time, they're tearing up pristine countryside for HS2. They're trying to increase road building and roll out and roll back the beautiful areas of countryside to build over them in the United Kingdom. So it's always a mixed bag. I do think that Boris Johnson is interested in conservation of the environment, and I think he sees it as a win to get on side with Joe Biden. But I think we will only actually see if he's willing to put his money where his mouth is and make some real commitments to environmental and biodiversity causes when we get to COP26.
Now, talking about the sharks, you've been diving with them, as I say. Let's take a quick look at that.
Oh, you got more videos.
Just while they set that up, let me make this point to you. That Boris Johnson is serious about the environment. Not necessarily because he's particularly green, but he undoubtedly sees it as a kind of icon or emblem of the new global Britain, post-Brexit, that he is trying to float, if you'll forgive the pun. And you're quite right that the Democrats in the United States, who are in power for at least another 3.5 years, are mad for green politics. Other kinds of politics, not so much. So it serves a double purpose in that regard. So my view would be, although you couldn't trust them with your sister or your wife, you could probably trust them to be serious about the environment. Can I see this shark video now? Let me see it.
If not, I can respond to that, George.
Can you explain it to us? What's happening?
Yes, well, George, this is off the coast of Britain, off the coast of Cornwall and Devon. We have blue sharks off our coast that you can swim with. They're totally friendly. They'll come up to you. They're like Labradors. It just shows the amazing biodiversity we have in our waters. Sorry if you hear background noise. I'm actually at the airport on my way to go and film another documentary. So I'll be heading out of here fairly shortly.
Let me just see you take the plunge. There you go.
Yeah. But it's amazing what we have in our own waters, and that's why there is such a battle going on, not only for fishermen's rights, for fishing rights, but also for creating marine protected areas around British coasts.
Now, James, you're telling me that shark is friendly. How sure, on a scale of 1 to 10, are you about that?
Well, I've done that twice, and British waters have been absolutely fine, and I've done it with much bigger ones around the world. It's actually us that is the issue for sharks, because we kill sharks by almost up to 100 million a year, humans killing sharks in industrial fishing. And that's decimating their numbers around the world. So really, the shark has to fear humans and not the other way around.
Well, I mean, if they've got no teeth or something, they look like they've got the wherewithal.
They're just little babies. Believe me, there are more sharks you want to be fearful of in Westminster than in our oceans.
Well, we'll be talking about them later. While I've got you, and before you get on that plane, James, what did you make of that story in the week about a humpback whale swallowing a lobster fisherman?
Well, if it's true, it's an amazing accident, and he's very, very lucky to get out of that alive. But you know what? Those whales they're a good news story, a conservation good news story, because we stopped targeting them with the industrial whaling fleets. Was it 50 years ago? And they have bounced back, and their numbers are in the tens, 20,000s all around the world, but they were down to just a few hundred. So that's a good news story, and that shows what can be done when the global community comes together to have a moratorium on industrial fishing or industrial whaling.
I've only got a minute left of your time. Did you see the story this week about the sea snot in the Marmaris Sea in Turkey?
No, I did not. You have to enlighten me.
There is a film, an ugly, slimy film, 2-3 feet deep in the Turkish Sea. No one knows where it's come from, and no one wants to touch it to do anything with it. Not to put too fine a point on it, it looks like snot.
Well, if it's natural, I'm sure it's not a problem, but you never know whether it could be man-made influences. Who knows?
Check that one out. It was a very interesting story.
Absolutely.
Have a safe flight, James, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us at more length. Absolutely fascinating work. How do people follow you?
Oh yeah, I've got Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all those usual social media channels as you too. And yeah, thank you for having me on your show tonight.
Fantastic. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. James Glancy, that's Glancy. He's a wildlife conservationist, and as you've seen, no mean filmmaker. I think that the first hour is almost over. So in the second hour, what have you got to look forward to? Well, a different kind of shark. We'll be talking to Paul Heron, Senior Solicitor at Public Interest Law Centre, about the very strong suspicion, for me, the jury has already returned and delivered its verdict, that the British public, and I'm sure the American public too, have been the victims of grand larceny of the public purse in the course of the coronavirus 19 pandemic. It's the first item when I come back, but first it is the news after I give you the phone numbers. In the UK, 08081 965522. That's completely free to call us. The lines are now open. And if you're in the United States, it's toll-free, which means it's also completely free. +1 844 944 3344. But first, it's the news with Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Leaders of the major industrial nations have pledged 1 billion COVID vaccine doses to poor countries as a big step towards vaccinating the world, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said. At the end of the G7 summit in Cornwall, he said countries were rejecting, quote, nationalistic approaches. He said that vaccinating the world would show the benefits of the G7's democratic values. There was also a pledge to wipe out their contribution to climate change. It followed the naturalist and television personality Sir David Attenborough telling the group of 7 leaders that we already have the skills to tackle climate change, but what we need is, quote, the global will to do so. The 95-year-old added that tackling climate change was now as much as a political challenge as it was a scientific one. He said, we know in detail what is happening to our planet and we know many of the things we need to do during this decade, he said in a pre-recorded video address. Boris Johnson is expected to agree to the delay of lockdown easing in England. The lifting of the last remaining coronavirus restrictions had been planned for the 21st of June under the government's roadmap, but due to concerns about the rapidly spreading Delta variant, this is likely to be postponed, possibly until the middle of July. Dr. Rahib Ali, a government scientific advisor, said that a delay to lifting lockdown is inevitable, and he expects the Prime Minister to say a delay is needed to make sure that we don't get to the situation where the NHS is unable to provide care to its patients. An announcement is expected tomorrow. British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has called for a bit of respect from EU leaders as he claimed the bloc's senior figures serially talk about Northern Ireland, quote, as if it was somehow a different country from the UK. The UK and the EU are currently at loggerheads over the implementation of post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland, known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, ahead of a grace period for some broader checks at the end of this month. The so-called sausage war had threatened to overshadow the UK's hosting of the G7 summit in Cadbury Bay, Cornwall, during which Boris Johnson has claimed some of the EU need to, quote, get into their heads that the UK is a single country. The Prime Minister's ire is reported to have been raised during his bilateral talks with French President Emmanuel Macron on Saturday morning. Boris Johnson is said to have attempted to explain his frustration with the protocol by asking what Macron would do if sausages from Toulouse could not be moved to Paris. The French president was claimed to have responded by arguing the comparison did not work because Paris and Toulouse were both part of the same country, suggesting that Northern Ireland is not within the UK. The Danish footballer Christian Eriksen is in a stable condition and has sent greetings to his teammates from hospital, where he remains under examination following his collapse and heart attack during Denmark's opening Euro 2020 match on Saturday. The Danish team doctor Morten Bossen confirmed he had suffered a cardiac arrest. Earlier, officials said that the midfielder was stable in hospital and had sent his greetings to his national teammates. Eriksen collapsed shortly before half-time in Denmark's opening Euro 2020 game against Finland on Saturday. Israel's parliament has begun debating the formation of a new government that would end 12 years of rule by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The prospective government, an unprecedented coalition of parties, has a razor-thin majority of 1 seat. If it's approved in today's vote, it would bring an end to years of political paralysis in which 3 elections resulted in stalemate. Right-wing nationalist Naftali Bennett is poised to become Prime Minister. In a power-sharing deal, Bennett, who heads the Yamina party, will hold office until September 2023, when he will hand over to Yair Lapid, leader of the centrist Yesh Atid, for a further 2 years. Netanyahu's trial on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust allegations he denies continues. The United States has suffered 267 mass shootings this year. That's the new tally after 4 incidents occurred across the country between Friday afternoon and early Saturday morning, according to Gun Violence Archive. Gunmen killed at least 2 people and injured at least 34 more in Austin, Texas, Dallas, Savannah, Georgia, and Chicago. And finally, Swiss citizens are voting today in a referendum which could see their country become the only second in the world to ban synthetic pesticides. One initiative proposes to end subsidies to farmers who use such pesticides, while another one would ban them altogether within 10 years. Supporters point to worrying levels of pesticides in water and damages to plants, animals and insects. But Swiss farmers warn the proposals will put many of them out of business. Switzerland's system of direct democracy means all major decisions are taken to the ballot box. Campaigners simply have to gather 100,000 signatures to ensure a nationwide vote. If approved, the pesticides initiatives would go much further than the handful of towns and regions around the world that have already banned all synthetic pesticides. It would also be of greater global significance than the similar ban imposed by Bhutan in 2013, as Switzerland is home to the world's biggest pesticide manufacturer, Syngenta. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, regular viewers and listeners will know my view that there ought to be criminal trials of our leaders for their many and various failures, neglect, negligence, and indeed corruption in their handling of the coronavirus. There is going to be a public inquiry, though inexplicably Dominic Cummings was right. It will not be until next year and will take several years, will not report before the next British general election, and therefore the people will not be able directly to exercise their own verdict on the stewardship of a pandemic which has cost the lives of a huge number of people, well into 6 figures, has cost the lives of many others because they were not able to get treatment, because the health service was overwhelmed by the coronavirus pandemic, all of which was predicted by the very same government we have now in their wargaming of what would happen in a pandemic to the National Health Service. And that's before you begin to calculate the economic cost of the devastation that has been wrought on the British economy by the coronavirus pandemic, and on the mental health of so many millions of our people who've had to live this utterly abnormal life now for as long as some of us can remember. But some people had a good war against the coronavirus. Some companies, particularly companies like Amazon, have had a bonanza of a time. Their profits, already gigantic, have multiplied over and over again as a result of switches in the market which have had to occur because of the closure of stores and the restrictions on stores that have variously afflicted us all of this time. The fact that the National Health Service did not have even basic PPE for its own doctors and frontline staff meant, for example, that it had to be procured on the market. And some remarkable people popped up to help the government out in their procurement. Friends, relatives of government ministers, of civil servants, bartenders to government ministers have reinvented themselves as suppliers of PPE. And there are many, many other issues. Paul Heron is a lawyer, senior solicitor, and founding member of the Public Interest Law Centre and has worked for many years in the law centres movement. My guess is that the law centres are going to be busy over the next few years dealing with legal cases against the government, against the state, for losses of people and things that have been incurred in the course of this pandemic. Paul is an executive committee member of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, and I'm glad to say he joins me now. Paul, thanks for joining us. Let's start with my thesis. There's every reason to believe that there has been widespread either criminal negligence and or actual corruption in the way that government contracts have been showered like confetti upon supporters of the Conservative Party. Am I right?
I think broadly speaking, George, you probably are right. I mean, there's been numerous reports in all the newspapers about various contracts going to friends and associates of various government ministers. And in fact, Transparency International ran a report which red flagged 1 in 5 of the contracts that have been granted during the course of the pandemic. And as you probably know yourself, there was a court case only last week where actually in one case involving Dominic Cummings and Michael Grove, that the court ruled that there was apparent bias. That's as far as it could go, or it was prepared to go, in relation to a relatively small contract that was given to a company doing public relations for the government. That contract was anywhere between $500,000 and $800,000. And the court found and held that there was apparent bias precisely because the contract not so much was given urgently, given the urgent nature of what we were involved in, but more importantly, there was no scrutiny of how that contract was given. And the court accepted that there was apparent bias. Now, maybe in other countries, people on the street indeed may not call it apparent bias. The runners of the case, the Good Law Project, called it institutionalized cronyism. I think other people might call it something worse. Certainly, phrases like corruption have certainly been bandied around. And I think during the course of the next 18 months to 2 years, these kind of cases are going to come more and more to court to look at the apparent bias, look at how these contracts have been given out with very little scrutiny in government and very little scrutiny in senior civil service. I would add one thing, interestingly enough, in the court case that was heard and found against the government last week, actually senior civil servants were against the way in which the contract was being given to Public First. And I think that's interesting to see how the civil service are going to react to the way in which the government has carried on over the recent period.
I'll come back to them in a minute. What are the consequences of that case that was lost by government ministers and factotums?
I mean, the consequences are really at this stage, George, it's a warning shot against the government. As to whether there will be prosecutions, I think that's unlikely. I heard you before talking about the possibility of criminal proceedings being brought. Well, obviously, that's a case for the powers that be, although as a public interest lawyer myself, one of the things that we've always been interested in and would certainly be looking at as information comes out is the possibility, if the state is not prepared to bring criminal prosecutions against government ministers, whether there's an orbit or an ambit or the appetite for bringing private prosecutions. The Public Interest Law Centre itself recently brought a private prosecution against a Sri Lankan diplomat. So we're no stranger to private prosecutions, but really we've got to be looking at whether the state's criminal prosecutors themselves will look at prosecutions, particularly the way in which these contracts seem to have been handed out.
Well, look, if you, there are lots of countries that it's not worth comparing with. But if you look at Israel, the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, is very likely to go to prison. It might be some way down the line for actually relatively petty examples of cronyism and corruption. This one you mentioned of £800,000, that doesn't sound all that petty to me. It's certainly much more serious than the Netanyahu case. But of course, there are cases involving tens, sometimes scores of millions of pounds that have contracts have been given out to people with no track record in the business concerned, companies that were just set up, the ink wasn't dry on their company registrations, whilst actual businesses that did have a track record in those fields were passed over. Surely they've got a right to demand prosecution or bring prosecution themselves.
I mean, I think potentially the way forward would be for public interest lawyers like myself, other public law lawyers, certainly to, over the next period, to be looking to gather sufficient evidence in which to present to the state prosecutors in the UK. And certainly to be saying to them, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what appears to be corruption, cronyism, whatever you call it. Because you're absolutely right in terms of some of the contracts that have been handed out. I mean, I think I read somewhere that a pest control company with about £19,000 in its books managed to secure a £109 million contract. Now, to me, on the face of it, that doesn't seem completely right. And it seems to be completely wrong that tested companies, I think there was reports of a company in Bolton that had a track record of producing PPE, actually wrote to the government and said, can we provide you with the PPE? And instead of taking them up on that offer, they didn't. They sourced PPE in Turkey, which then proved to be, not up to standard. And that same company was forced, or not forced, but quite happily, I presume, exported its PPE to the United States. So I think there are cases there, and it should be handed over to the DPP, to state prosecutors. Now, are the state prosecutors necessarily, even with a fraction of the evidence or even a lot of evidence, would they be prepared to prosecute? Possibly not. But maybe their failure not to prosecute would potentially be open to a judicial review itself, a challenge in the court of the failure of the state prosecutors to pull the cronyism and the obvious, gangsterism, if you like, and call it to account. Because you're absolutely right. This kind of thing really shouldn't have happened. And it happened primarily because two things, really. Number one, the government did not prepare, refused to prepare, and didn't see it as the serious way that lots of other people very early on were seeing it. And the second thing is they ignored all the warnings. All the warnings were there straight away, early on, that this was going to rip through the country, and they had a false ideology. And maybe that false ideology was linked to the fact that they knew, after 12 years of austerity, that the state, the NHS, and various other state agencies were not prepared, could not be prepared for this. And so there's lots of things stemming from this which really should make not just yourself angry and lawyers like me angry, but also the man on the street angry, and really the trade union movement angry as well. The
cronyism, certainly if Scotland is anything to go by, the cronyism, I assure you now, will preclude any action by the state prosecutor. In Scotland, the state prosecutor is a member of the SNP cabinet. The SNP gave out £500 million worth of contracts, mainly to companies sympathetic to and in bed with the SNP. So don't look for any prosecutions by the state north of the border. I doubt if it will be any different here in England either. But for example, there was a cabinet member, an extremely important one, who did not know that a company 25% owned by him and the other 75% owned by a member of his family got a whopping contract to supply the government with PPE and other medical equipment. As you do, you know, you're a quarter owner of a company, you're in the government, you're in the cabinet, but you don't know that your company is about to have a bonanza at the public's expense. There's another cabinet minister, maybe it's the same one, whose neighbour and publican, who served him pints on a Friday night, he also got a bumper contract for supplying things that he'd never supplied to anybody in his puff. I mean, it stinks to high heaven, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And I come back with 2 points. I think the first point is, I think most people would probably say with the 30-odd billion pounds that has been spent on the track and trace system is certainly not money well spent. It's an app with a barcode, and that money would have, in my opinion, been better resourced either to frontline services or to local authorities so that we could localise the track and trace mechanism. I think that has been an appalling waste of money, £37 billion.
Yeah, it's the biggest scandal of them all. It's probably not corrupt. It's probably only criminal negligence. And that's what we voted for, a government that is criminally negligent. So
I would pick up, though, on your second point about I have, unfortunately, direct experience of sadly, the Scottish government. As you may know, we represent a number of core participants in a current public inquiry on undercover policing. And we tried to extend the terms of reference to Scotland to allow that kind of thing to be covered in Scotland. And sadly, the Scottish government opposed us in court and refused to extend the undercover policing inquiry into Scotland, which I think, given the kind of things we've already uncovered in England and Wales, is also unfortunate that it wasn't, gone north of the border as well, to allow people who've been spied on over the course of 20, 30 years to come forward to tell their stories.
Unfortunate, so, yes. Indeed. Paul, thanks very much for joining us. Paul Heron, Senior Solicitor at Public Interest Law Concern. Now, here's the question. The Wizard of Oz opened this week in 1902. Who knew? 1902? Did they even have movie theatres then? The Wizard of Oz opened this week in 1902. Where? A, New York. B, Chicago. C, San Francisco. Answer after the break, and I'm taking your calls too, so get them in.
Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The airwaves. This savannah is a rigid dichotomy of fact and fiction. As vicious as the Twitter sphere, where the slightest misjudgment can spell being cancelled. One species rules over the airwaves through its ability to adapt and survive in even the harshest environments. The George Galloway. The top cat in these parts, it is mostly active on Sunday evenings in Britain and mid-afternoon in the United States. It seldom roars during the day. Most notable for its wide variety of headdress, it protects these parts from the mainstream media. You can catch this fine specimen on the mother of all talk shows. Don't pick a fight with it. They've been known to bite back.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Well, I'm taking your calls now. Here's the numbers. If you're in the UK, absolutely free. 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. Completely free to call me. And if you're in the United States, it's equally free. And it's +1 844 944 3344. You can email the show anytime, by the way, at onair@moats.tv. And of course, you can tweet me at George Galloway at RTUK News. Now, The Wizard of Oz opened this week in 1902. Where? The answer is Chicago. Now, do they mean opened on the cinema or on the stage? Whatever, it's quite striking that a film that children still watch today and enjoy today first was shown in 1902. How's the poll doing? Why is Canada in the G7? Lots of snow, 38%. Lots of money, 42%. Lots of values, not so much, 20%. Now, by the way, coming up also later in this hour, just for a brief one this time, is the Moats medic, Dr. Ranjeet Brar, who'll be talking about the football incident involving Christian Eriksen. Now, MK says, what the hell was that supposed to mean, George? To support anybody over Croatia? Ha! Writes a man that knows nothing about the Second World War or about the war in Yugoslavia. GH says, Scotland gave football to the world, George. Well, is that actually true? Was it Scotland or was it England? It was definitely Britain. Of that we can all be proud. And Jonathan Wildman says, so you welcome a news network that will blame black people for all crime, all Muslims for terrorism, and an all-round echo chamber for far-right views. Seriously, George, you're endorsing that? Jonathan wrote that before GB News actually went on the air. But he's already pronounced that it will blame black people for all crime, all Muslims for terrorism, and be an all-round echo chamber of far-right views. That's Jonathan Wildman, who goes by the name of Madame Wildman, the crystal ball clairvoyant, and she has got a shack on the front at Blackpool. He can tell your fortune. He can tell the future. Celtic Man says, stuff it about Canada. They are our good neighbours to the north, and they have always had Britain's back in all those wars and never got the credit they deserved. And Henry Wilson says, the BBC could never devolve to the level of Fox News. The British sensibility is much too great. And Stephen Davis says, I guarantee GB News will be another LBC. That's a local radio station. And Bushman says, Biden is a globalist and hence will take the side of the EU over the UK. And Dan Eady says, it's so hot today, my pot noodle is not cooling down. You want to try it here where I am, mate. And Morris Mack says, when are you going to get Pierre Corey on to talk about ivermectin? Don't be a coward. That's me, Morris. I'm a well-known coward. Everybody knows it. Everybody watching and listening here knows that I'm a well-known, inveterate coward. And Anna Bushman says Andrew Neil was the most impartial presenter on the BBC, grilling left and right wing equally. And Joanne Nairi says, I think Canada is in the exclusive club of the G7 because they follow America like a puppy dog. And Bushman again says gammon is a pejorative term used by the loony liberals for anyone who doesn't support identity politics and virtue signalling. And Jezza 1 says EU hands off our sausages. And Johnny Dunlevy says Brexit is a battered sausage. They sell that in the chip shops in Scotland. And Michael Curry says Sausage Gate. And Schlab Commandante says all wars are sausage wars. And Big Jim Tang says I want all sausage statues removed. Let's go to Scotland and talk with Alistair in Maryhill. Go ahead, Alistair.
Hi, George. It's great to talk to you again.
And you, sir, go ahead.
I hope by the grace of God that you are well.
All good, thank you very much, by His grace.
Yeah, I was particularly interested in your guest from Ireland and the points that she was making about the border.
Yeah.
Now, as a Scottish person, obviously, we've kind of inherited quite a lot of that sectarianism from Ireland via, particularly with the Irish immigrating to the east end of Glasgow, and then the whole Rangers Celtic thing and the bigotry, and I can't stand it. But, so, are you with me so far? You know that.
Well, I'm not just with you, I'm one of them. So, yes, definitely I'm with you.
But my question to you specifically is, if the SNP has such hate laws that you can't sit at your own kitchen table and speak to your own family in a pejorative sense about a person from another race, then why in God's green earth do they allow orange marches to continue? And I ask that as someone raised Protestant. And I know that you're your own Catholic, but I don't think that we have beef there. But I'd be really interested in your views. How can these marches of hate still be allowed? Is something behind the scenes going on that allows this? Like, I don't know, Masons or some other organisation, because there are hate speech.
As will be obvious, I'm not either an Orange Marcher or a Mason. But I do think that people of that tradition have the right to march. I don't find them attractive, but I think that the slope that one would be going down to ban such marches would be a very slippery one indeed. And it wouldn't be long before people were demanding other marches were banned that they disapproved of. So you'll never find me on an Orange March, but I support the right of Orange people to march.
Okay, I'll go with you on that, George, but why is it then that the SNP has hate laws that wouldn't even allow you to...
Well, it's a very good question. Very good question. It's a very, very good question. But these hate laws are not actually about religious or racial hatred. They have been introduced to jail people who insist that women are women and that men cannot declare that they are women and legally become so. Although Sir Keir Starmer has just pledged the next Labour government, whenever that is, will also legislate to allow that to happen. So it's a vexatious question and one that frankly boggles my mind, but that may just be my age and class. Let's go to Richard in Manchester. Go ahead, Richard.
Good evening, George. Thank you very much indeed for letting me put my point of view. George, this Professor Heenan, who was on with you tonight, I agreed with quite a bit of what she was saying. But can I take your mind back to Mrs. May and Ollie Robbins trying to con the British people, and I think it was Ollie Robbins who went into some nightclubs in Brussels, and he was overheard and recorded as saying the people in England think, and this is a fact, George, that Mrs. May is going to get us out of the EU, but what she's going to do is keep us closely aligned to the EU, so we won't in fact be leaving, blah, blah, blah. And he was mouthing off when he'd had a few drinks. Mrs. May denied this, even in Parliament, and it was sort of, brushed on one side. But, George, that is what we've been fighting, and you have been fighting, along with Nigel Farage and a few good, honest people who would stick up for this country and stick up for the rights, and for the radio stations that stick up for the rights of people, and not for these other stations who don't want us to know the truth. This van der Leyen came online, and because of the fact that the vaccinations didn't go her way and she was losing a lot of kudos in the EU, she then introduced the section of the protocol which really declined everything that had happened before, and she was going to stop us from having the vaccinations. I think I've got everything chronologically in line, but she was just trying to save her own face. And in fact, she nearly got fired by the EU, but she said, stick with me, and at the end of my 5-year term, you will find that I'm a good person. I'm surprised you haven't had a big phone call from Nigel Farage, because I remember distinctly him saying about her when she came on that her politics are poison. All she wants is a globalist world, and that's what she's been appointed for as the senior commissioner in the commission in Brussels. And we've all gone through the Blairs, the Campbells, we've gone through all these people telling lie after lie after lie. And now they're still trying to get us out of the EU. And as far as Johnson's concerned, he has taken more flack, and I'm not a Johnson supporter, than Mrs. May was absolutely useless. Everybody up the north here, she's been responsible for what happened, because Nigel Farage told us, instructed us, whatever, to vote for Johnson, otherwise we would never get out of the EU. And that was true. And I do believe, leading on from what you discussed with this lady, Professor Heenan, that at the end of the day, what happened, nothing else could be done. They put the protocol in. May knew what was happening. And even Barnier, now he's going for some presidency in France or whatever, has come out and agreed that he shouldn't have done some of the things that he did against the United Kingdom. And I admired him for that. But it's a long way away, 5 years to go from having a vote, winning it democratically, and then everybody trying to smash democracy. And
well, that's the long and the short of it, Richard. I'm glad we're out of it. And the more I see of them in the years that they've been trying to hobble and cripple Brexit, the more I'm glad that we are out of it. But that doesn't mean that Boris Johnson isn't a thoroughly dishonest cove. Every one of us knows that he's a thoroughly dishonest cove. That in another era would have been horsewhipped by fathers up and down the line, up and down the land. He undoubtedly lied to the Ulster Unionists, and both they and ultimately he may pay a price for that. I want to see Ireland united. If British Brexit accelerates that, which I think logically it very well might, then that's a bonus for me. Now, I have to ask you another question. Carole King's album went to #1 this week in 1971. What was it called? A, Camellia, B, Tapestry, C, Kingdom. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
From the makers of Track and Trace comes the Boris Johnson SatNav.
Right, next right. No, left. I mean left.
What?
Yes, this left. Oh, crikey, you've missed it, bugger.
Bloody Tories.
Or have you? Turn round. Or, in fact, don't turn around. Carry on. Yes. You have arrived at your destination.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Carole King's album was, of course, Tapestry, released in 1971. The chilling thing is, although it was 50 years ago, I remember it like it was yesterday. More or less the same result in the poll on Canada, so not much to update you with on that. Now, there's a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol. Let's hear from her. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George. I'm usually at the end of the show.
But we're so happy to have you at this early hour.
I was only a couple of points. Nobody seems to, well, I don't know whether it's just me, but Japan is part of the G7, isn't it?
No.
Well, I understood it was.
Is it? Is Japan in the G7? Does someone tell me?
It is. I mean, as far as I understand it, there's a
I beg your pardon,
country.
Norma. I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
That's why you're a legend. Japan is in the G7.
Well, nobody ever seems to say much about their economy, but anyway,
not very good. I can tell you,
I don't know why
tell you
they're
it's
in it.
not very good and hasn't been for many decades.
I wonder why they're in the G7, really.
Well,
anyway,
Italy and Canada are even more mind-boggling, are they not? It's not obviously not a collection of the world's biggest economies, because the world's biggest economies are not in it. It's not a collection of the world's biggest democracies, as Attila, the Hun, has just texted me, because the world's biggest democracies are not in it. India's a democracy, it's not in it. Indonesia's a democracy, it's not in it. Russia's a democracy, it's not in it.
Yep.
China's a different kind of political system, but it's the second biggest economy in the world, and it's not in it. So it's quite obvious that it is a collection of people who'll do what they're told in the service of the United States of America, to me. Go ahead.
Well, I just wonder if they're just one of the biggest economies that make all the weapons, you know? Whether that's got, but that's more like NATO, isn't it, really?
Yeah, rather.
Anyway, George.
Yeah.
We've had a lovely weekend.
Very good. It's been so hot everywhere.
Yeah, but we bought some lovely new hi-fi equipment and a radio for my husband.
Very good.
And we bought a great big, it's a nicer television for my Nest, which is upstairs.
You've got a Nest?
Sport. Well,
Men have got a den, you've got a Nest. How wonderful.
Yeah. It's to get away from my husband, really. Anyway, and I just wondered if this June the 21st will be moved to mid-July, and there's all this tennis, football, cricket, what's going to happen to the supporters? Will they be curtailed, or?
That's a very good question. Well, we won't know until tomorrow.
No, I know.
He's going to make a statement on what's to happen next. He'll have to deal with that issue because it's a live one. I mean, if it's being extended, what will happen to crowds coming into games and so on, concerts, the West End theatres are in meltdown. Andrew Lloyd Webber is going to open illegally if necessary in the West End. He'll take them to court and all. It's all a bit of a muddle, to say the very least.
I know. But the thing is, there doesn't seem to be much consistency with the various crowds. Some are distant, some are not. And because
well, the G7 weren't very distanced, were they?
No, they weren't. The Queen was very close, you know.
They were all doing the elbow bump when the cameras were on, but they had their arms round each other's necks. Some of them with a different purpose to others. As soon as the cameras were switched off, and the 95-year-old monarch who had to sit at Prince Philip's funeral on her own with a mask on, was up close and personal with creatures like little Macron.
She was, yeah. Well, anyway, I think the Queen looked quite happy, to be quite honest. But I'm just a bit fed up.
I wish that she'd used that sword that she used to cut the cake. I wish she'd used it more deftly.
Oh, come on, George. We just get violent. Anyway, cheerio.
She could have whipped off a toupee or two. Thank you very much, Norma. Yeah. Enjoy your TV and your hi-fi. And Gayatri says she wants to take a look at your Nest. I don't know if she's planning on one in our house.
Well, she can always come. It's upstairs, George, upstairs, you know.
All right, thank you, Norma. Wayne is in Cheshire on Joe Biden. Go ahead, Wayne.
Always a pleasure.
And you?
I don't see the point in these so-called world leaders having these, what's just happened in Cornwall, because...
The G7, they call it.
They call it. Because President Biden is obviously 100% not in charge of America. I've watched him over the course of the last couple of days, and 4 separate times I've seen his wife run after him, hold his hand, pull him back, same as what you would do with a toddler. He obviously, I'm not slagging him off, but he obviously doesn't know where he is, and surely he can't be in control of the launch codes for the nuclear weapons. That's
well,
what
I think
I'm afraid
that's a very powerful point. Accepting your last bit, I've just written my column for RT.com along the same lines. I too have been watching the video. Be interesting to see what US callers think about it. But I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Like a senile old man, or as you say, a toddler, if it were not for Mrs. Biden, Joe Biden would have walked off the end of the pier. He would have walked into the waves. He literally did not know where he was, where to go. And if he is in charge of the nuclear button, then God help us all.
Well, I wouldn't obviously think that he is, but maybe this is the way America want to play it now. Maybe it's always been that way, as though people behind the scenes have controlled everything. I don't know, you know more than me, but at the moment, so this G7 that's just gone on, Biden is obviously not competent to stand for the United States. I presume there's people there who make the real decisions. Do you know?
Oh, there must be. I don't think the vice president's there, but I mean, she'll be on the phone. Or perhaps she's hoping he does walk off the end of the pier. If it wasn't for Mrs. Biden, he'd still be wandering around looking for his sausages because he literally got lost. Several times I've seen it.
Yeah, it's awful, but he's obviously he's there just as a front man, and these decisions are being made somewhere else.
Well, I suppose people get what they voted for, and if they voted for Joe Biden, some people dispute that. If they voted for Joe Biden, well, they just have to lie in the bed that they've made.
I think that's the way things are going, because I think Boris Johnson was mostly voted in because a lot of ladies just liked him as a clown, and he is a very likeable person. I like him. But I think they're not stupid, the Tory party. They put these people in place knowing that they're going to get all these insane votes. I watched something the other day and they were asking about why did you vote Conservative over Labour in that by-election that just got Labour lost. And a lady said, because Jeremy Corbyn wanted me to grow sunflowers in my garden. This is the sort of insane answers that people are coming out with. I actually believe that before anyone has the vote in this country, they have to take a test of competence, because it's dangerous what people are voting for and they don't understand what they're actually voting for.
As Mark Twain said, democracy is about counting heads, not what's in them. Thanks, Wayne, in Cheshire. Now, the Moats medic is back, albeit briefly, to give us a kind of update or reading on what happened to Christian Eriksen in the Denmark-Finland game yesterday, and I'm most grateful to him. Dr. Ranjeet, thanks at this notice for stepping in. I got an anxious call from my 14-year-old son to switch on the television because he believed that Christian Eriksen had just died in front of everyone's eyes on the football pitch. Have you any idea what could have caused that? I'm not receiving Dr. Ranjeet. Okay, we'll come back to Dr. Ranjeet. We've lost the sound there. Now, on the G7, Joanne says, looks like Canada's values are the same as America's values, and so that gets them in. Anthony says, very few Canadians have any allegiance to Canada. Here in Toronto, we often identify with the culture of our parents rather than Canada. There is no Canada. And Neil says UK political players are all bought and paid for by the US anyhow. And The Truth Hurts says Canada has so much value that the Huawei CEO's daughter is still being kidnapped. And on GB News, Dean Redgate says, ever since hearing the thumbs up George gave to GB News, I'm having my first doubts of the man. It's concerning. Well, thanks for watching or listening, Dean, despite your doubts, you Egypt. And Dick Whittington says, G. Galloway becoming like Enoch Powell. What's wrong with these people? What's wrong with you? Call me up and say that to my face. And Andrew Cunningham says, well said, George. It's literally unbelievable how the BBC seem to put the people who paid their bills down. They need to be defunded and stand on their own 2 feet. And Johnny Dunleavy says Andrew Neil's in the Whig Party. Andrew Neil doesn't have a wig. That is one of the urban legends or myths. I know that because I've been up close and personal with him many times. Tony says, I will never watch the BBC, ITV or Sky again. GB News will be a huge success because it will not be biased at all. I'm sure it will be biased. And yeah, I told you about Attila. Attila Desix says the G7 was set up as a talking shop for the planet's leading democratic nations, like Canada. Russia and China are anything but democratic. Well, how are you defining that, Attila? Russia has elections. Its parliament is elected. Its president is elected. The opposition have newspapers and television stations. In what sense is Russia not democratic? In what sense is Italy one of the planet's leading democratic nations? In what sense is Canada? You're talking through your hat, Attila. Why don't you call me on the numbers aforementioned and we'll have this out. Now, Harjeet says, I'm curious about your thoughts on the booing of players taking the knee. Is it too simple to say that all those booing are racists? Can there be any fair reason to boo the gesture? I cannot think of one myself, but I'm reluctant to make accusations in case I have missed something. Great show, he says. Harjeet in Hounslow. I'll come back to that, Harjeet, I promise. But I need to talk with Dr. Ranjeet, alas, only on the telephone. Doctor, what can you tell us about what happened to Christian Eriksen yesterday?
Hi, George. Sorry we're having some difficulties, but it's good to be with you.
Thank you.
It's not totally unusual for young, extremely fit athletes to have cardiac problems. And in fact, most of them, especially in the Football Association, would be routinely screened for these. Clearly, it's different from people. We think of elderly people as getting coronary artery disease leading to heart attacks, and that's caused by high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, age, and certain other genetic factors. But this is a different disease. So in the young, it tends to be either a problem with the conducting system of the heart, so they get an arrhythmia, a sudden change in their rhythm, where they get a very fast or a very slow heartbeat and leads to a loss of cardiac output and blood pressure. Or the most common thing is some structural abnormality of the heart. Obviously, we're talking about incredibly fit individuals. It's kind of well known, for example, Christys, our British great sprinter, now retired, used to have a resting heart rate of about 30 beats per minute, where I have one of 55, average of 72. And so it means that the heart is incredibly strong and incredibly efficient. And all of that training leads to an actual increase in the bulk of the muscle of the heart and a slight change in its structure, which means that sometimes with extreme stress, it has difficulty, because of its own muscular bulk, pumping blood through it. That's a really strange idea. It's called HOCM, or hypertrophic obstructive cardiac myopathy. And of course, we'll conditions as well, but those are the most common. And you know, without wanting to be prurient or intrude upon his privacy, these are the most common problems that could lead to a heart attack in someone so obviously young and generally fit. It's not common. It is routinely screened for, and clearly, obviously, whatever the cause, we wish him the best, and we're very happy that he was resuscitated at least and has gone to get medical care.
Yes, I was going to come on to that, and of course, say all of us about his speedy and full recovery. But it's unlikely he'll recover to be a frontline international level athlete again, or is it? Can you so recover from a cardiac arrest to still continue as an athlete?
Yeah, it's possible, George, but clearly having so there are two things. One, is there any lasting damage to the heart, and we don't know that. It'll be early to say. And we hope there isn't lasting damage to the heart, but even then, he would want to ascertain the exact cause and see whether that cause is treatable. If it was an arrhythmia, if it was an irregular heartbeat caused by an abnormality of the conduction system of the heart, sometimes that can be treated. There are conditions like Wolff-Parkinson-White where there's an abnormal conduction pathway that can be treated or ablated, and then actually you're at low risk of further events. If it does turn out to be this hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, then it's less likely he'll come back, even in the absence of severe damage to the heart, simply because there would be an increased risk of further events. So you're right, the prognosis in terms of his sporting career is great, even as we hope he will survive this event, George.
And now the doctors said that they felt that they had lost him there on the park, but the doctors and the other physios and so on seem to have done a remarkable job because by the time he was being carried off, on the pictures, which perhaps should never have been taken, you could see that he was by then kind of trying to sit up, and therefore my son's fears that he had died were unfounded. What would the doctors have done there on the park?
So essentially, George, they will be using standard cardiopulmonary resuscitation, advanced life support techniques to give cardiac massage, the kind of repetitive pumping of the chest, which is actually to do the heart's job for it and restart the circulation, and also to provide oxygen into the lungs. And that will be the absolute mainstay. Apart from that, there are drugs to administer, and it's possible to, depending on the rhythm of the heart, to use electrical shock treatment also to try and restart the heart. But clearly, they were able to do so, and the quicker they're able to do so, the better the outcome for the patient. And it did actually seem that they, as you say, were able to get a return of spontaneous circulation actually relatively quickly, and that all bode very well for Christian Eriksen.
Fantastic. Thank you, Doctor, at this short notice, and notwithstanding the technical difficulties, talking us through what might have happened there on the park. Goodness, I'm 2 minutes late for the news with Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Leaders of the major industrial nations have pledged 1 billion COVID vaccine doses to poor countries as a big step towards vaccinating the world, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said. At the end of the G7 summit in Cornwall, he said countries were rejecting, quote, nationalistic approaches. He said that vaccinating the world would show the benefits of the G7's democratic values. There was also a pledge to wipe out their contribution to climate change. It followed the naturalist and television personality Sir David Attenborough telling the group of 7 leaders that we already have the skills to tackle climate change, but what we need is, quote, the global will to do so. The 95-year-old added that tackling climate change was now as much as a political challenge as it was a scientific one. He said, we know in detail what is happening to our planet, and we know many of the things we need to do during this decade, he said in a pre-recorded video address. Boris Johnson is expected to agree to the delay of lockdown easing in England. The lifting of the last remaining coronavirus restrictions had been planned for the 21st of June under the government's roadmap, but due to concerns about the rapidly spreading Delta variant, this is likely to be postponed, possibly until the middle of July. Dr. Rahib Ali, a government scientific advisor, said that a delay to lifting lockdown is inevitable, and he expects the Prime Minister to say a delay is needed to make sure that we don't get to the situation where the NHS is unable to provide care to its patients. An announcement is expected tomorrow. British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has called for a bit of respect from EU leaders as he claimed the bloc's senior figures serially talk about Northern Ireland, quote, as if it was somehow a different country from the UK. The UK and the EU are currently at loggerheads over the implementation of post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland, known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, ahead of a grace period for some broader checks at the end of this month. The so-called sausage war had threatened to overshadow the UK's hosting of the G7 summit in Cadbury Bay, Cornwall, during which Boris Johnson has claimed some of the EU need to, quote, get into their heads that the UK is a single country. The Prime Minister's ire is reported to have been raised during his bilateral talks with French President Emmanuel Macron on Saturday morning. Boris Johnson is said to have attempted to explain his frustration with the protocol by asking what Macron would do if sausages from Toulouse could not be moved to Paris. The French president was claimed to have responded by arguing the comparison did not work because Paris and Toulouse were both part of the same country, suggesting that Northern Ireland is not within the UK. The Danish footballer Christian Eriksen is in a stable condition and has sent greetings to his teammates from hospital, where he remains under examination following his collapse and heart attack during Denmark's opening Euro 2020 match on Saturday. The Danish team doctor Morten Bossen confirmed he had suffered a cardiac arrest. Earlier, officials said that the midfielder was stable in hospital and had sent his greetings to his national teammates. Eriksen collapsed shortly before half-time in Denmark's opening Euro 2020 game against Finland on Saturday. Israel's parliament has begun debating the formation of a new government that would end 12 years of rule by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The prospective government, an unprecedented coalition of parties, has a razor-thin majority of one seat. If it's approved in today's vote, it would bring an end to years of political paralysis in which 3 elections resulted in stalemate. Right-wing nationalist Naftali Bennett is poised to become Prime Minister. In a power-sharing deal, Bennett, who heads the Yamina party, will hold office until September 2023, when he will hand over to Yair Lapid, leader of the centrist Yesh Atid, for a further 2 years. Netanyahu's trial on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust allegations he denies continues. The United States has suffered 267 mass shootings this year. That's the new tally after 4 incidents occurred across the country between Friday afternoon and early Saturday morning, according to Gun Violence Archive. Gunmen killed at least 2 people and injured at least 34 more in Austin, Texas, Dallas, Savannah, Georgia, and Chicago. And finally, Swiss citizens are voting today in a referendum which could see their country become the only second in the world to ban synthetic pesticides. One initiative proposes to end subsidies to farmers who use such pesticides, while another one would ban them altogether within 10 years. Supporters point to worrying levels of pesticides in water and damages to plants, animals and insects, but Swiss farmers warn the proposals will put many of them out of business. Switzerland's system of direct democracy means all major decisions are taken to the ballot box. Campaigners simply have to gather 100,000 signatures to ensure a nationwide vote. If approved, the pesticides initiatives would go much further than the handful of towns and regions around the world that have already banned all synthetic pesticides. It would also be of greater global significance than the similar ban imposed by Bhutan in 2013, as Switzerland is home to the world's biggest pesticide manufacturer, Syngenta. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, I'm still trying to work out the criteria for membership of the G7. Turns out it's a values-based organization. They used to talk about rules-based, but that began to get ridiculous the more and more rules that they actually broke. So now it's values-based. I've opined about Canada's values just at the beginning of the show. I should make the point that in Canada were buried today virtually the entire Muslim family in London, Ontario, who were mowed down in a terrorist attack, although they don't seem to call it that or cover it quite so candidly as that. When the person driving the car, the murderer, mass murderer of a whole family out for a walk, is a committed white Christian. That's what happened in London, Ontario. I'm just getting news now that there have been 4 mass shootings in 6 hours in the United States, which have left 39 people wounded and 5 dead. 4 mass shootings in 6 hours. Values, eh? Anyway, my good colleague, Rachel Blevins of RT America, she's been off for a couple of weeks. We've had stand-ins who were good, but not as good as Rachel herself. I'm glad to say she's back now. Rachel, welcome back to the show. Be sure we missed you. What can you tell us about the mass shootings, or is that just actually such a low level of fatalities that it hasn't even appeared on your news?
You know, it's interesting, George, how the media decides to cover a lot of these shootings. And obviously it is absolutely tragic anytime you hear news like this, and especially when you hear news of a number of mass shootings happening in multiple cities in such a short time frame. But it is notable how the media decides to cover it, you know, whether they decide to speak of the shooter as a terrorist or whether they decide to simply say that he was mentally ill or having issues here and there, or even how politicians decide to respond to it. I know that the Biden administration has said that they really want to take on the problem of mass shootings, but of course it all comes right around back to Congress and whether or not anything that they pass is actually going to have any meaningful consequences, because a lot of times what we find with a number of these shootings is that the shooters already had a gun illegally, or in some cases, they would have already passed the background checks that Congress wants to enact. So it really is a multi-layered problem that, unfortunately, there's no administration that is going to be able to come in and come up with some magic solution that is going to solve it all together. But I think when it comes to the media coverage, I mean, in some cases, you don't hear about them at all. And then other cases, they get days-long coverage. And it just seems to be exactly whatever narrative they fit, so to speak.
Yeah, now, you know, because you know me, I mean no disrespect at all to the great American people, but watching closely your president here in England, in Cornwall at the G7 summit, I've got to tell you that I wouldn't send that man out to buy a loaf. I would have absolutely no confidence that he would come back safely and with the loaf and the proper change. He was captured on camera multiple times, literally lost, and his wife chasing after him, as one would a toddler, to grab him and turn him round and point him in the right direction. Has any of that made it into American discourse, into the American media?
You know, it's funny that you bring that up because no, not at all. I mean, if you look at the media coverage of Biden's appearance at the G7 summit, you would think that it was all sunshine and rainbows and that everything was just absolutely wonderful. And it's funny because I was reading this article earlier that was published by CNN, and literally the entire article was devoted to talking about how great it was that Biden was at the G7 and not Donald Trump. And they went on and on to say how all of the leaders were just at peace having Biden there, and they were so glad that they didn't have to deal with Trump. And then they included this one short little paragraph talking about how there were a lot of tensions between the leaders when it came to China, and then went right back to saying, well, at least Biden's there. So I think the spin that you're seeing the media put on this right now is incredibly concerning, especially when we look at the fact that this is just the beginning of Biden's appearances that he is going to be doing this week. I mean, he's setting up for a one-on-one meeting with President Putin in just a few days. So it makes you wonder, if they're already putting such a spin on it right now, then what do we have to look forward to this week?
Well, Mrs. Biden will definitely have to accompany him to the meeting with Putin and probably straighten his tie and make sure he's not drooling. It's that bad, I'm sorry to tell you, Rachel. Now, although Russia and China weren't at the G7, they were living rent-free in the G7's heads. I suppose that was a dominant part of the discourse about it.
It certainly seems to be that way, and this is yet another summit where we're seeing Russia and China be the main topics, and yet they're not countries that any of these countries are actually at war with. So we know that they are likely watching these talks that are going on. We know that they are watching the headlines that are coming out of these talks. And certainly they must be wondering why they have the United States going up and saying it's time to counter China, to counter Russia, to really build up tensions. But yet, on the other side of things, the U.S. wants to talk the talk, but they don't really want to walk the walk. I mean, they can say that they want to ramp up a trade war with China, or that they want to ramp up their military presence around China, but they're not willing to completely cut off their reliance on China. And at the same time, when it comes to Russia, you know, I think that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is the perfect example here, because we're watching the United States for the last several years. It has literally threatened sanctions against some of its closest allies in Europe over them allowing a pipeline connected to Russia when it has nothing to do with the United States. And yet the U.S. has really ramped up those tensions. They're pulling back a little bit now. But at the same time, we found out that in 2020, the U.S. imported a record amount of oil from Russia itself. So they're happy to talk to the rest of Europe and to tell them about how they really need to be ramping up tensions with these two countries. But at the same time, the U.S. itself is kind of going back and forth on exactly how it wants to treat them. It wants to talk tough when it comes to that rhetoric, but then it actually doesn't want to follow up in a number of those actions.
That is a fascinating series of points. Now, I can tell you that the G7 leaders were undoubtedly happy that Trump wasn't there. And however ineffectual Joe Biden might have been, obviously when he's got an auto cue in front of him, he can still read it. It's in the off-stage, informal moments when he's exposed. But they're very glad that Trump wasn't there. A lot of people are very glad that Trump wasn't there. His behavior was abominable, even to the Queen. Donald Trump was undoubtedly a boor, a vulgarian of quite extraordinary proportions. You mentioned the Nord Stream 2. Him and Mike Pompeo behaved towards European countries like they were in The Sopranos over the Nord Stream 2. They were bullying, browbeating, threatening. At one stage, the Germans even offered Pompeo a €1 billion bribe to allow them to continue to do what was their sovereign right to do. So, you know, I'm not saying that Trump was good or anything, far from it. But I kind of do miss him. American politics was much more interesting when he was there. The G7 would have been more interesting if he was there. I'm wondering if anyone in America feels the same.
Well, I would argue that the mainstream media feels exactly the same way right now. That's why they keep bringing Trump up in all of this. They keep reminding you of what it was like when Trump was there. And, you know, it's interesting because we watched for several years CNN, Fox News, the New York Times. They all wanted to talk about Trump nonstop. And now that he's kicked off of social media, now that his presence has kind of been belittled in every way possible, it's interesting to see how they have turned. They're not talking badly about Biden, but the person that they are presenting a lot of negative coverage about right now is Vice President Kamala Harris. Oh. We're watching, as you know, over the last week, we saw her in Guatemala, her speech that was heard around the world saying, do not come to the United States. We saw some of the interviews that she did after that when she made it clear that it was okay that she hadn't been to the border, even though that was her exact assignment. But at the same time, she said that that was fine because she hadn't been to Europe. And it's funny to see the media kind of do this turn, and all of a sudden they have made Kamala Harris the problem, not just with the Biden administration, but with the Democratic Party. And so I think it's interesting that now all of a sudden she is the bad guy while Biden is the golden child trying to find his way around the G7 summit.
It was extraordinary, her performance in Guatemala, a country in which, by the way, the United States has repeatedly overthrown its governments, installed its puppets, helped to wreck its economy by its neoliberal economic prescriptions. And then Kamala Harris, the nice cuddly Democrat, shows up in town to tell them not to dream of coming to America. The very thing they excoriated Donald Trump for doing, albeit in probably inferior syntax.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because that's just another example of how these policies aren't changing. I mean, Kamala Harris was there talking to a country that, like you said, has been directly impacted by U.S. foreign policy and a number of reasons why these people are fleeing their homes and their countries and putting themselves in direct danger to try to get to the United States to seek asylum is because of those policies that were put in place in the first place. And yet it's just another reminder of how much really hasn't changed between these two administrations. I mean, whether it's Harris talking about immigration and repeating talking points from the Trump administration, or it's Biden saying that he's not going to pull back on tariffs against China. He's not going to pull back on this continued mission to increase tensions with China and Russia. I mean, it really makes you wonder why there isn't more of a focus, and of course we can't expect it from the establishment media, but why there isn't more of a focus on just how much the status quo has continued from one administration to another, and the only thing that's changed has just been these talking heads who now we're talking about the other aspects of them or what they said and did, and yet that seems to be the only meaningful change.
How wonderful to have you back. Rachel Blevins, remember your name. I know you remember your name. I want everyone to remember your name. You're going far. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Let's take a call. Chris in Nottingham. Go ahead, Chris.
Hello, George. I'd just like to say how much... Yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Very good. I'd just like to take you to task about your comments on Andrew Neil and his show not being the new Fox News.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
And although I agree with you on many points, especially with regard to Palestine and coronavirus and most left-wing issues, I have to say that, in my opinion, Andrew Neil is nothing more than a right-wing establishment stooge.
As opposed to the BBC and Sky?
Well, no, I'm not bringing them into it. I mean, you're trying to say that he's not going to be the new Fox News.
No,
and I don't.
Well, he can't. First of all, he can't be the new Fox News because the GB News is governed by Ofcom, and Ofcom put Fox News off the air precisely because of its partisanship. So it literally is not the case that it's going to be a new Fox News. But I'm interested in why you think Andrew Neil is right-wing when all of the television is right-wing.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, on your point about not the new Fox News, I'd like to quote one major bugbear that I have got with the media and the BBC, and why I think the BBC isn't much better than Fox News, and that's with regard to the fabricated anti-Semitism campaign that was whipped up, politicised, weaponised, exaggerated, and which included many false allegations, as far as I'm concerned, including the one that Labour had an anti-Semitism problem, when the BBC and Andrew Neil, who spouted this line several times, especially to Jeremy Corbyn, they all know that several surveys have found that there is less anti-Semitism in the Labour Party than there is in the right-wing parties like the Tories and UKIP.
You'd rather expect that, wouldn't you?
No, I expect fair, unbiased.
No, I mean you'd rather expect that
there was,
sorry, you'd rather expect that there was less anti-Semitism in a Labour Party than in UKIP, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would. But my point is, they were trying to say that Labour was institutionally anti-Semitic, and that it had a problem with anti-Semitism. Well, if there's less anti-Semitism in Labour than in the right-wing parties, and also less than in the general public, how can Labour have a problem with anti-Semitism?
And you hold Andrew Neil responsible for that, do you?
Well, he towed that line several times in front of
the BBC's line
Jeremy
several
Corbyn.
times. I've no doubt.
Well, if he was a trust...
I completely disagree with him on that. In fact, I'm the only person you know that went on the mainstream media and gave long and powerful interviews in defence of Jeremy Corbyn on that very subject. Haven't I?
Well, I'm very grateful to you for that, George. But as far as I'm concerned,
I don't want you to be grateful to me. I'm just wondering why you phoned up to attack me about something Andrew Neil did that I disagree with.
Because you seem to be presenting Andrew Neil as a fair-minded, good broadcaster, but he's not. He's totally biased.
Well,
he's totally biased.
He's absolutely a good broadcaster.
He went along with the lies about anti-Semitism.
I didn't say he was St. Andrew.
Well, no good broadcasters will toe a lie.
Chris, let me speak. I didn't say he was St. Andrew. I didn't say I agreed with him politically. In fact, I explicitly said I did not. But he is a Premier Division broadcaster in global terms. He will. Let me finish. He is as mean, as really mean to leading Conservatives as he was to Jeremy Corbyn. And that's why Boris Johnson literally ran away from the prospect of being interviewed by him. Am I right or wrong?
Well, you're wrong, because the big difference is that when Boris ran away, he was scared of being exposed for his own lies. But when Jeremy Corbyn was interviewed, it was the big establishment lie that was being thrown at him by Andrew Neil.
I'm not in second place to you.
Andrew Neil was the one who was pushing
Chris,
the
I'm
lie.
not in second place to you on denouncing the weaponization of anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn. Truly, I'm not. But that does not mean that Andrew Neil is not a world-class broadcaster and journalist. And
well, I'm sorry,
moreover,
but let me just,
have you seen this? Have you seen his channel yet? I haven't.
I've seen plenty of his shows I've seen his ITV late night show and his BBC shows, and I know enough to know that no world-class broadcaster will toe a completely fabricated establishment lie as if it was the emperor's new clothes.
Well, they will,
because they wouldn't be fair-minded, and they wouldn't be a real journalist.
But then they wouldn't be on the BBC, as Noam Chomsky famously put it to Andrew Marr. You would not be here unless your political views coincided with the broadcaster that you are working for. And Chomsky was right about that. What are you looking for? Do you think someone like me is going to become a major force in the BBC or on Sky or Channel 4? What standards are you applying here, is my point. These are capitalist television channels. They employ people in plum positions who support the political, social, and economic worldview of the broadcaster concerned. You must know that. What are you looking for? Chris Williamson to get a programme on the BBC?
I do know that, but I expect more from you than to call him a world-class broadcaster who's just told one of the biggest establishment lies in the whole of this century.
Look, Lionel Messi is a world-class footballer. I don't like him, but I'm not going to deny that he's a world-class footballer. And in denying that Andrew Neil is a world-class broadcaster, you are showing yourself to live in a parallel, alternative universe in which people like you and me and Corbyn have power and influence. We don't.
George, if you think that people who toe lies like the anti-Semitism lie and can still be a world-class broadcaster, I'm afraid I'm sorry to hear it.
I keep losing, Chris. I'm sorry. Let's go to Nathaniel in Berkshire on Russia. Go ahead, Nathaniel.
Hi, George. I was just wanting to ask you about your statement that Russia is a democracy when you're on about countries in
Something's
the G7.
happening to my sound. Can everyone else hear Nathaniel? Because I can't. But I want to.
Hello?
Nathaniel? What a pity. Please call back, because I do want to hear what I think your question was leading to. Vob says, it's early days, but it looks a little low budget when you take the money behind it into account. Unlike us, which is no budget and very, very beautiful to look at. Moats looks more professional. Thanks, Bob. They can improve, of course. I think their biggest issue will be a lack of diversity of views, though. The presenters are mostly from the same ideology. Well, no change there then. Captain Thunk says, needs time to bed down. All new channels and services do. I have high hopes, as it's very clear certain voices aren't heard on the current channels. That said, I think some topics will still be avoided, e.g. Assange. Yes, I can hear you, Chris. And Jamie says, another right-wing agenda TV company. And Woof says, people are sick of cancel culture telling us what we can say, what we can think, what we can wear, what we can drive. GB News, I hope, is the spark that brings society back to common sense. Nathaniel, yeah, I do want to talk to him. Go ahead, Nathaniel.
Hello, George. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was just talking about your statement on Russia being a democracy and how it isn't in the G7, which I do think it should be, because it would be a good idea.
It used to be, of course. It used to be the G8.
Yeah. But in 2014 it'll change, and that's what I wanted to talk about, as well as the Alexei Navalny. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
You are.
Yeah. I just wanted to talk about that, because surely if it's a democracy, they wouldn't outright just ban any opposition to the Kremlin.
Have you ever heard of Julian Assange?
Yes, I have. WikiLeaks.
Is Britain a democracy because it's got Julian Assange in Belmarsh jail on trumped-up charges in a COVID-ridden maximum security jail? I can assure you Julian Assange's prison conditions are much worse than Alexei Navalny, and he, the latter, has been actually convicted in a court of a crime, the crime of fraud, of defrauding a French perfume company.
That's ridiculous.
Well, it's true. According to the French perfume company.
I thought it was I thought he was exposing lies.
That's because you're believing the lies that you're reading and hearing on the mainstream media, Nathaniel. He's in prison for fraud. Fraud against a capitalist company in the West, in France.
Wait, so is he not the WikiLeaks guy?
Oh dear. No, Julian Assange is the WikiLeaks guy.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Navalny.
Oh, sorry. Right. Okay, I was a bit...
Sorry, we're at cross purposes there. Anyway, go on. Are you here to say that Russia is not a democracy?
Well, obviously, I'm not as well informed as you. So if I'm wrong in any way, just blame my ignorance, I suppose. But from what I've read, it just doesn't seem like one with.
But that's because of where you read it.
So you're saying it's like a media lie spread to make us believe that it is?
I mean, how do you define a democracy? Russia has an elected president. It has an elected parliament. It has elected local government, regional government throughout its vast country. It's never done having elections. Is that not a definition of a democratic country?
Yeah, no, it is. But so we're just saying that Britain and Russia are equals. And there's no
equals in what sense?
In the democracy's way.
In the democracy
obviously Britain is not perfect with first past the post and all
here's
that.
one way in which Russia is a better democracy than Britain. The opposition have television stations and multiple newspapers, daily newspapers. But the opposition in Britain don't have either of those things, do they?
I suppose, well, isn't a lot of our media right-wing biased?
Yeah.
Like the Daily Mail, the Telegraph and all that.
Does the Labour Party have television stations? Of course it doesn't. Does the Labour Party own newspapers? Yeah. Of course they don't. Does the opposition in Britain have huge media power? Of course they don't. But in Russia they do. So there's one metric by which you could say that Russia was a better democracy than Britain.
But surely you could also argue
let me finish. In Russia, they elect their head of state. In Britain, they do not. The head of state is the eldest child, formerly eldest male child, born to the previous king or queen. But in Russia, they elect their president. In that sense, they're more democratic than us. In Britain, we have a House of Lords, which is one half of the British legislature.
Yeah, that's
None of them are elected. All of them are appointed. Many of them corruptly. In Russia, they don't have a House of Lords. There's another metric by which Russia is a better democracy than Britain. Over to you, Nathaniel.
I was just going to say that the House of Lords, there was that news piece about one of them being given 500,000 by Boris, But anyway, what I do think that even if Russia is, like, if people think it isn't a democracy or anything, but of course you've put some light on the situation for me. Thank you, George.
You're welcome. And if you become a regular viewer and listener, you'll begin to see how so much of what you have been told is a complete lie. Now, I need to ask a question. Winston Churchill's finest hour speech was delivered in this week in 1940. What was it referring to? A, the evacuation of Dunkirk. B, El Alamein. C, the Battle of Britain. Answer after this quick break.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Comrade, tired of being trapped in mainstream media? Join the revolution with mother of all talk shows. Has been instrumental in making brain and heart of people stronger, like kettlebell for mind. Don't be brainwashed, CC, an open mind to new way of thinking. If you don't know how, George will teach you. If you won't learn, he Well, make you. Speak to Comrade Galloway if you think you're hard enough on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Churchill's finest hour speech, of course, referred to the Battle of Britain. Now, I promised Harjeet that I would deal with the question of players taking the knee and others booing it, and I definitely will before the end. But first, I'm very glad to be joined by Patrick Christy, who is a media man of note himself and who is our regular commentator on the media and politics in Britain. Patrick, welcome back to the show. Nice to see you again. I've got to say, from what I'm reading, the launch of GB News is not getting rave reviews.
It's a mixed bag. It started out with a couple of little basic errors, I suppose you could say. Andrew Neil, for example, the great Andrew Neil, of course, was wearing a black suit in front of a black background, so it did look a little bit like he had a floating head for quite a while. There were some issues.
That would never be allowed on here.
No, you could never do such a thing. That wouldn't fly here, would it? And there were some issues. So some of the sound was a bit out of sync with where the lips were moving. It looked like quite a badly dubbed Chinese movie for a little while. But on the whole, now things have sorted themselves out. Dan Wootton is currently in full flow. And I think, look, at the end of the day, yes, their graphics do look a little bit cheap, and there were a couple of teething issues, but they need to be given a fair crack of the whip, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I'm battling here against leftist critics who are horrified at my welcome to GB News. Frankly, the more television news channels there are, the better chance I've got of getting on them to get my point of view across. And the better chance there is of you getting on them. It's... the fact that it's going to be a right-wing channel, well, all the channels are right-wing. Why are you picking on this particular one? It's got to be an improvement, surely, on the BBC, and I think also Sky, if they can get these problems sorted out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Look, at the end of the day, any kind of addition to the media circuit is no bad thing as far as I'm concerned. I suppose it does ultimately as well mean one more voice to hold power to account. And that is good, even if it is supposedly going to be leaning to the right. I think they're going to do things very differently. It's not going to be a rolling news channel in the same way that Sky News is, for example. They're going to have their topics. The presenters do seem to have a lot more of their own creative freedom, and then more license and more freedom to then go and express their own opinions on it. What I would hope, and I hope this doesn't happen, but what I would guard against if I was GB News is the idea that almost through no fault of their own, they appear to have given the impression that they're going to be a right-wing news channel, that they are going to be have a certain view on certain things like Brexit, etc., etc. Now, if there are elements of that TV channel that then prove not to be that, they've hired quite a lot of people for the BBC, for example. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of production staff that are ex-BBC as well, and there's not everyone there is right or even centre right, and without really meaning to, or without really promising anything, I just wonder whether or not they might inadvertently let some of their audience down just because it's not what they expected. But look, you obviously got to let them stand on their own 2 feet, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, the inveterate hatred of Brexit in the rest of the broadcast media, which you and I are both well aware of and indeed have suffered to some extent from, definitely leaves a space in the market for the majority of the British people who supported Brexit. Ditto this kind of woke, liberal identity politics culture. All the stations, all of them, are absolutely infatuated with that kind of cultural politics. So that too leaves a gap in the market, no?
Absolutely, 100% agree, George. This is where we're at now, which is that if you could set your clock really by, if you turned on the BBC, especially a lot of their radio output now, they'll be talking about one of several same issues, right? It will be something to do with gender or something to do with race, something to do with unconscious bias. There'll be some kind of social issue there. And even their good news story at the end of their segments now, quite often, all too often in my opinion, actually, it's not good news. It's someone has lost their entire family in a house fire and now they've decided to walk from Land's End to John O'Groats. It doesn't make you feel fuzzy inside when you hear it. Whereas actually what GB News are planning on doing is a dedicated good news section, which I think we need a bit of, because it's not just relentless social issues. I think that we keep hearing here on a lot of our press. There's so much general negativity and negativity about Britain as a whole. There's lots of good things that happen here in this country. We've been known to make some of them ourselves every now and again, and it would be nice if one of the news outlets actually had a concerted attempt to point that out for us. You don't always have to go and feel like you need to go and see a therapist after you watch the 10 o'clock news, George, A
very good point. Now, Anthony in Bristol has got a question for both of us, I think. Anthony, welcome.
Hi there, George. Hi there, Patrick. Hi there. George, I was only responding to a point that you made with regard to one of your callers about whether there is an honourable reason for opposing the England players.
This was Harjeet, yeah.
That's right. And I'm of the opinion that I would not support England whilst the players are taking the knee.
That's a bit extreme, isn't it?
No, I think you can't really divorce the gesture of Black Lives Matter with the movement of Black Lives Matter, with the organisation of Black Lives Matter. And I see the organisation of Black Lives Matter really as a conflation of Marxism and anti-white racial hatred. I can go on why I believe that.
Yes, do.
A skewed view of history, for instance, that somehow white people are the villainous people of history and others are the injured innocents of history, that somehow we invented slavery, brought it to Africa, ignoring the extensive involvement of Africans in slave trade, and also that white people also have been enslaved throughout history, if you take into account feudalism, serfdom in Russia, and also formal slavery as regards the Barbary pirates and so on. I could go on to many examples.
Yeah. No, you're right on all those things. Of course, the pyramids were built by slaves, and I don't think the British had been invented yet by then. So some of the points you're making are powerful enough. I'll let Patrick answer, but I do have to make the point to you not to support your own country in the European Championship because they want to kneel down for 30 seconds. It's a bit extreme.
Well, insofar as they appear to be paying homage to an organisation that despises me for who I am, for my own heritage.
They've told you umpteen times they're not actually doing it to any movement, however despicable. They're doing it because a lot of them are black, and they reckon that in the United States and in Britain, black people are getting a raw deal from the police. That's how it came about. And not many people would actually, not even many of the police in America would argue otherwise. Patrick?
Yeah, I think you make some incredibly good points there. What I would say is I'd be quite keen to find out exactly when is this going to end. Do we kneel down before every major sporting event now just until the end of time? Is that what happens? I think there's this age-old argument, isn't there, of politics in sport, and it's all very well and good saying that, okay, yeah, and the idea that every time Harry Kane gets down on bended knees in some way launching the Communist Manifesto is a nonsense. That said, this is not my fault. The Black Lives Matter organisation did publish a manifesto, and some elements of that could be considered to be Marxist, and therefore, if you're taking the knee in the name of the Black Lives Matter movement, or to be seen to be adding, potentially anyway, to be adding soft power to that particular movement, that is politics in sport, and I'm not a fan of that. That said, politics is everything, isn't it, I suppose? And just lastly as well, quickly on that one as well, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the British people didn't invent slavery, and someone like myself, I'm half Irish and I'm half Greek Cypriot. You can go trace my family back as far as you like, and we were just a different kind of farmer on a slightly different patch of land. We've never enslaved anyone, and the idea that I have to apologise for any of my ancestors' past, I think is a bit of a failed notion, you know.
No, well, my ancestors were white, Irish, and Scottish, and they had no privilege, I can assure you. Anthony, last word to you. I'll let you go then.
Yeah, sure, George. I would only just say that I would just dispute some of the issues around policing in America, for instance. If you look at the figures for homicides, for robberies, and given that I think it's about 50 to 60% with African Americans, even though they're only 13% of the population.
Well, nobody's saying that a lot of criminals in America are not black, but this all began when we all watched live on video a man being murdered by a police officer. And he was later convicted of that murder. Nathaniel, Anthony, thanks for your call. Patrick, on the taking the knee thing is proving now extremely controversial. It falls under that old rubric about the music hall. It was a good turn, but it went on too long. It seems to me obvious now that consensus is breaking down, not just amongst the fans, but amongst some of the players. Scotland, for example, are not taking the knee against the Czech Republic, but are taking the knee when they play England on Saturday. Not sure of the logic of that, but there you go. It's beginning to break down. Friday, I beg your pardon. It's beginning to break down in a bit of disarray. So it really would be a good idea to bring it to a dignified end now, wouldn't it?
I think so. I absolutely think so. And it touches on something that we were almost speaking a bit about before, which is the dichotomy between what you hear a lot presented to you in the media and actually what the public think. Now, when we had football matches taking place behind closed doors and it was empty stadiums, you know, and actually what you'd do is you'd hear the player, see the players take the knee, there'd obviously be no response to it whatsoever. The commentator would say something along the lines of, you know, this is the campaign to end social injustice everywhere and racism everywhere, something like that. And then they get up and they carry on with the football. The second you have fans back in that stadium, a cacophony of boos was ringing out. And that kind of just shows you a bit where we are. Now, the idea that every single one of those people is racist, or the idea that every single individual that calls this show or tweets about it or whatever, that doesn't want to take a knee for the Black Lives Matter movement, if they were all racist, then we've got an absolutely massive problem in this country and indeed around the world. A problem I refuse to believe we have, certainly to that extent. And so there's a huge difference there, I think, between what we're told we should think about things and what we actually, a lot of us, do think about it. What I will say, and I spoke to John Barnes, actually, earlier today, and he said, look, he doesn't see the point of taking the knee. He's
a black international footballer, I should point out to those who don't know him.
Sorry, yes, and a singer as well, lest we forget. But also, he basically said, look, it's time for action now, okay? We've done the kneeling, and that's fine, and that's okay. You can put a fist in the air. But actually, we need to start seeing real change. And so I would suspect if I was part of the Black Lives Matter organisation or one of the players associated with it now, I would be saying, actually, maybe relentlessly taking the knee is holding us back, if anything. We need to start cracking on elsewhere now.
Mike in South Carolina on the G7. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, George. Good to talk to you again.
And you, sir.
Yeah, just before we go to the G7, just a brief comment on what you're talking about. And that is that the whole taking the knee thing and the fist raise is all a product of American stuff. I mean, even back in the days of the Olympics when we had a few black athletes who took the podium and raised the fist, okay? And now, when they went to the American
and it was extraordinarily powerful, but it didn't didn't become a ritual that everybody had to do.
No, they were actually excoriated for what they did, the people there that participated.
I know
and
John Carlos. I had the pleasure of spending time with him. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, but in the American football, you need to take a look at this started in the national anthem, and you have to look at the origin of the national anthem, that was written by Francis Scott Key, who is a devout racist, and he has several verses that don't show up in the national anthem that are seriously racist. So, take it all with a grain of salt and just look up those lost verses of the national anthem. But let's go to the G7. It's a joke. It's a horrible joke. Just, and its only purpose is to further American and capitalist, basically empire. And it's the same with NATO, and it's also the same with the United Nations. Those things should be done away with. Nobody should have power to, overrule everybody else and what they do. What we have to go to is a genuine, World United group that actually, has representation by population.
Well, they may say you're a dreamer, Mike, but you're not the only one. Thanks for that. John is in Dorset. Go ahead, John.
George.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a slightly facetious point about all this going down on the knee that the footballers are doing at the moment.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether, I know I'm being sarcastic, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. I wonder if it would be possible to replace that George Colston, was it George Colston statue in Bristol?
Edward Colston.
Edward Colston, beg your pardon. With a life-size statue of George, my brain's gone. Who's the bloke that they're all worshipping at the moment in America with the gun?
I don't think they're worshipping him. He's a lifelong criminal.
George Floyd, that's it, George Floyd.
One of the many unfortunate things about all this, Patrick, is that Floyd himself turns out to be a thoroughly nasty piece of work.
Yes,
a man
exactly.
with multiple and vile crimes to his name. That doesn't mean, of course, somebody's got the right to murder him, least of all whilst wearing a police uniform. But the point that John is making is that people have venerated almost this very bad man.
Yeah, well, 100%. And I think when you see as well things like even in Manchester, for example, there's a huge mural of George Floyd sprayed. It's actually a very nice piece of art. It's just of this particular chap in Manchester city centre, and these things are right around the world. And he's become a visible symbol of a fight against racism. And in some ways, I feel like it's quite an unfortunate individual to have. Not chosen, of course, he didn't choose himself, did he? What happened to him was awful, but to be there because, he has had a checkered past to say the least. And there's certain elements of this as well that clearly play into racist hands, basically, don't they? Because of the nature of the individual, what he'd done on the day was allegedly paying for something with a counterfeit note. He was apparently under the influence of some quite heavy-duty drugs as well. So it all adds to this notion, I think, doesn't it, that essentially allows racists really to caveat what happened there and almost excuse it in a way that obviously should never happen,
And this, the official BLM in the United States is, of course, quite apart from its political platform that you referred to. Some of its leaders are now being drummed out because it turned out that it was Black Lives Mansions that they were buying. Some of them in gated, almost exclusively white communities and so on. BLM, despite receiving millions of dollars in corporate donations and sponsorship and so on, is itself rather a discredited organization now.
I would argue that it absolutely is. And I know we touched on this earlier relating to the kind of Marxist element of it, etc. Now, I think that actually what they did there was something quite sinister, which was start out as something that they allegedly said was all completely and utterly, totally anti-racist. The name itself, Black Lives Matter, is something that you just cannot deny. You cannot argue against that name, right? So they've got a very strong brand there from a political sense as well. And then what they did was kind of them publish their manifesto, keep it a little bit quiet as well, kind of anyone initially who said there's quite a famous broadcaster in this country, for example, who lost one of his jobs anyway for saying that they were a Marxist organisation early on, and they kind of. I found that quite sinister, but then this is where it does get quite fruity, is that some of the founders of it now, as you've rightly said, have multiple different homes in multiple different plush communities, and millions in the bank. And, you do think that actually could there not be more direct action for black people, essentially, who Black Lives Matter is supposed to represent? I do think that there is a relatively strong militant undertone. However, that said, in a lot of, pressure or activist groups, that's existed since the dawn of time, I suppose. So that's nothing new.
Patrick Christys, as always, straight talking, straightforward. Always a delight to be with you here on the mother of all talk shows. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. I don't know if I handled the questions correctly. I don't know if I handled this show better than GB News handled their first show. All I know is they've got a multi-million pound budget, and we do not. In fact, if you knew the budget on which this show was made, you'd laugh or cry. You'd cry at least. if you were me. So, if you enjoyed the show, please, oh my goodness, look at the poll, 3,257 people have voted yes. 57% of you think that you're going to beat the BBC and Sky. Only 23% think they will not. 20%, though, think that GB News will fail. I hope it doesn't fail. Good luck, Andrew Neil and GB News.